Today's video will be another volume of true demon stories. But before we go into that, if you're new here or haven't done so yet, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and also hit that notification bell. I'll be posting over 100 videos this year and keeping an active pace. Alright, let's dive into the video. So, I don't know how many people really believe in ghosts or the paranormal, or in people who say they can see them. I wouldn't ever say I'm some professional psychic or medium. I'm definitely not. I just know I've always been able to see things other people couldn't, hear things other people couldn't, and I knew things other people didn't. Pretty much my whole life, I felt like a freak and a weirdo for a long time, until I just realized this is happening and it isn't going away, so I needed to accept it. I got help from professional mediums and the woo-woo community, and it actually helped. Backstory, but important. I was laying in bed in my room a couple years ago trying to fall asleep. It was a long hallway, and my sister's room was at the end, so was my mom's. My sister had a friend over who was dealing with an abusive boyfriend, and they were drinking and talking about it. Keep this in mind as this will be important. You know how you get the feeling someone's watching you? Or that feeling in a store when you just know someone stepped into your space? You don't have to look, you just know. That's what I felt. I looked up and there's some girl there with her head poked into my room sideways. I just saw her head sideways leaning past my door frame. She looked shorter, maybe in her 20s, long black hair, kind of like that girl from the Ring movies. I'm looking at her wondering what she wanted, and she started to smile. Slowly, her eyes got huge and black, and her jaw unhinged into this huge, sick, pitch black smile. Ice cold slammed into the pit of my stomach as I just stared at her for what felt like hours, frozen in fear before what I'd been taught kicked in and I made her leave. She instantly turned back to normal and skipped off down my hallway towards my sister's room. I thought, oh, it's with my sister's friend. Depression and abuse, all those bad situations can really attract those types of beings, so I didn't think anything of it. Fast forward to literally last night. It's been years. My parents got divorced, which is a whole other post of creepy shit. I realized it wasn't just my dad that was the narcissist. It was absolutely my mom too. They were a toxic pair, and currently I'm in a situation where I have to live with my mom. It's fine. It's free. I'll be grateful and deal with it. Last night, I'm laying in bed watching TV, minding my own business. Suddenly, I feel that feeling again. It's always the same feeling, regardless what type of ghost it is. For me anyways. I look at my door and it's the exact same girl. I asked her what she was doing here. She didn't answer. She just started smiling wickedly. Only this time, her eyes went white and her mouth grew into the same huge black grin, but she had tons of teeth like a shark. This is where a professional medium could figure all the ins and outs of who and what and where and how, but I'm not that good. I get up to get my incense, which drives them out, and she runs in the direction of my mom's room. I go out into the hallway to look in that direction, and I see through my mom's cracked door this weird demon girl literally sitting crouched on top of my mom staring at me, like she's an animal claiming her prey. It was wild. I've never ever seen anything like that before. Ever. I also realized this girl was never with my sister's friend. She was with my mom. For however many years. But the thing is, my mom's crazy and very, very negative regardless of what anyone does to help her. She loves drama and loves being a victim and loves complaining, so it's matching her energy, I guess. The ghost girl feels more like a bully than anything truly demonic. Like she had fun picking on people, which my mom absolutely does too. The ghost girl can't hurt me. She's just around, and man, it sure is scary when she is. She looks like an absolute demon, that's for sure. I've since seen other types of entities in her room at night while she slept, and I've told her about it. She says I'm crazy in one sentence, and then in the next says how it does feel dark. We shall see. So I had an experience in my old house back in 2010 to 2012. It lasted 2 years. I don't really tell anyone about my story because not only do I look crazy, but I also look like a liar. But I swear everything is 100% true. The first experience I had was when I was over the phone with my friend. We'll call her Anna. She moved to Oklahoma, so we talked over the phone every night. One night we were talking on the phone as usual, and I heard a knock on my door. It was 3 knocks to be precise. I didn't think much of it. I thought it was my mom, so I said, "Come in," and there was no answer. Instead, 3 more knocks, more aggressive than the first set of knocks. "Come in," I yelled, and still nothing. I then heard tapping on my door in 3s. I got up and opened my door and nothing was there. My mom had already fallen asleep in the living room, and my dad was fast asleep in their bedroom. My friend Anna and I were freaked out, but I didn't think much of it after that. But after that event, everything got worse. I would be woken up with nightmares, being pinched and my hair pulled. I decided to sleep in my parents' room for a whole year because being in my room was just too terrifying to me. My parents thought I was looking for attention. I was homeschooled around this time, only being in the 8th grade, and when I was home alone, I would hear bangs in the sides of the hallway walls. I remember feeling like I was being constantly watched, so much so that I felt freaked out to change out of my clothes into my pajamas. I started to spend a lot of time at my other friend's house. We'll call her Jane. And the entity started following me there, so there was no escaping. Jane only lived with her mom, and her mom worked a lot, so we were home alone a lot. And we began to hear the same pounding knocks on the sides of her hallway walls as well. We both smelt a foul burning smell, almost like a dead animal or something rotting, with a mixture of gasoline. We would light candles to try to drown out the smell. It would keep us up half the night by slamming things in the other room or knocking on the other door. I just want to add that she had no animals and her mom went out a lot after work, so no one was home. But once I left her house, she didn't hear any noises, nor did any strange occurrences happen. After a while of dealing with loud bangs and noises, my dad's things started to disappear and then reappear in random locations of the house. For example, his spare car keys went missing out of his drawer in the bedroom and ended up in the bathtub of my bathroom. Naturally, my dad accused me of messing with him, but it wasn't me. One time I was at Jane's house. It was a Friday night because I always stayed with her on Friday nights. And my dad calls me. The conversation went like this. Me. "Hey Dad." Dad. "Are you at Jane's?" Me. "Yes, why?" I could tell my dad sounded a little panicked, but I wasn't too concerned. Dad. "Well, something mimicked your voice to me. I was in the living room reading a book waiting for your mom to come home, and I heard you enter from the garage into the house and announce to me that you got bored at Jane's house." Obviously, I was shocked, because I didn't leave Jane's house at all that night. My dad stated that he got an unsettling feeling because I don't have a garage door opener, and that I always came through the front door. He told me that at first, he thought he was hearing things, but then my dog reacted to the sound of my voice and ran down the hallway to greet me. And when he went to my bedroom, I wasn't home. I wasn't in the house at all. Needless to say, my dad finally believed me, but my mother is still skeptical because she never experienced anything. After a while, strange noises and occurrences finally started to diminish. We moved out of the house, and very rarely do strange things happen. Maybe once every couple years I hear or experience something I cannot explain. I guess I will never know as to why a ghost or demon, whatever it was, would try to scare me every day for 2 years, but I'm glad that it has stopped. When I was 14, I had a strange encounter that still puzzles me to this day. On the weekends, I'd sometimes go to my mother's place. My parents are divorced. The house she lived in was converted into several small apartments. It was a creepy old farmhouse. The house was at least 150 years old. My mom told me off and on about strange sounds she'd been hearing and seeing things in the corner of her eyes, feelings of being watched. This one particular evening when I spent the night, I brought my N64 because my mom would go to bed early and I'd still be up for a few more hours. I still remember to this day what game I was playing. WWF No Mercy. I was sitting Indian style on the floor playing the story mode. I just finished a mission in the game and set down the controller to the left of me. Directly behind me was a recliner. I'll never forget what I saw next. I went to grab the controller and saw what appeared to be a hoof next to the controller on the floor. Insects and blood were coming out of the silver that separated the hoof. I slowly glanced up and this demonic figure was staring back at me. It leaned down towards me. Its face got down in my face and grinned the most evil smile. The eyes were black and full of hatred and rage. Face red, one-winged creature. Blood was dripping from the tips of its jagged, sharp teeth. It was so surreal I immediately went into a panic attack and blacked out. I learned later it was the fight-or-flight response. Several seconds later I came to, laying on the floor, could barely move. The demonic figure in the chair laughing at me. It was as if my fear and energy had been sucked dry from me. I lost all my strength. It was frightening. I can't put it into words just how bad it was. I did all I could to crawl away from it while clenching my chest. My body shaking uncontrollably from the fear and panic, and when I looked over my shoulder, seeing it laughing at me. My mother's room was a mere 15 feet away from the TV, yet it seemed like forever crawling there. I did all I could to crawl to my mom's room and woke her up. I couldn't speak or stand up for quite some time after witnessing what I had just went through. After I woke her up, we talked and she believed me. She told me that her and her boyfriend had seen the same thing weeks earlier but didn't want to scare me. I don't know what to make of it and still think of it to this day. I have no doubt demons and angels are real, and believe me, the last thing you ever want to encounter is a demon smiling in your face. I don't care if you believe me or not, but when 3 people see the same thing on 2 separate occasions, at 2 separate locations, either we're all crazy, or something is or was wrong with that old farmhouse. My mom told me prior to her moving into her apartment, her and her boyfriend had seen the same thing while they were living at my grandfather's house. My mom has thankfully moved since, and we haven't encountered that thing again. A few years ago, I was living in an older house in a small university town in northern Idaho. I had been living in that house with 3 other roommates for a few years at that point. My roommates had come and gone. My mental health was an ebb and flow, just like any other person. At this point, my sister was living with me and had experienced her own paranormal things that I was indirectly connected to. But for the purpose of this post, I just want to focus on one particular experience that I had with a little girl. This particular night, I had done my nightly routine. Washed my face, brushed my teeth, scrolled through Instagram, the works. It was just like any other night. Eventually I tucked my phone out of reach and fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, not completely unusual. I usually wake up once or twice during the night. It's pretty rare for me to sleep through the whole night. Usually I just turn over and go back to sleep, like usual. But this night wasn't usual by any stretch of the imagination. There's one window in my bedroom which faces the neighbor's porch light. They very rarely turn it off, so there's always a certain amount of light coming through my window into my room. But when I woke up, everything was dark. I didn't immediately think anything of it. I mean, at some point the porch light would have to burn out and be replaced. Honestly, it didn't even cross my mind. Something was up. My anxiety, something I'm medicated for, immediately spiked. My heart began to race, and any ounce of tiredness I had in my eyes was gone as I stared wide-eyed at a little girl. Across from me, crouched by my bookshelf, only about 2 feet tall, maybe less, was a gray little girl. She looked emaciated. Her hair was almost sticky-looking and matted. She was wearing a nightdress, think Little House on the Prairie, that was shredded at the bottom and dirty. She was crouched almost like a frog, and it was almost like she was soaking up whatever light there was that was coming from the window, making the room completely dark except for a gray light emanating from her. If that was all it had been, I think I would have just rolled over and gone back to sleep. I had done something similar to a shadow figure over my bed previously, but it was her face. Her face told me she wasn't some innocuous child, spirit, ghost, or whatever. She was something awful, and something I needed to fear. Her eyes were very large, and she had no eyebrows. Her matted bangs covered most of her forehead so I could focus on her white iris and goat pupils. If that wasn't enough, she was smiling at me, but it wasn't a sweet smile. It was a menacing, evil grin. She was something awful. It stretched from ear to ear and bored into my soul. Once I realized what was going on, that there was an evil-looking child in my room, I went into fight or flight. All I could get myself to do was hide underneath my covers. I didn't scream, jump out of bed, and run. Nothing. I was so scared I couldn't move. Eventually, I knocked myself out of whatever terrified trance I was in. I had regulated my breathing and my heart rate went back to normal. I peeked out from under my covers and saw that there was nothing there. I was so relieved and figured that somehow a bad dream had kind of leaked into real life for a moment. I got up from bed, weary but confident that it was an absolutely terrifying dream. I decided if it was a dream, I would go downstairs to grab a glass of water. When I have bad dreams and I don't move around, I can get sucked back into that dream, and from my reaction to this one, I absolutely wanted to not get sucked back into it. So I got my glass of water, climbed back up the stairs, and walked down the hall to my bedroom and put a half-full glass of water on my windowsill. I didn't have anything else to put it on by my bed. The entire house was silent. I managed to fall asleep again. I don't know how much later I woke up again. The room was again so dark. I immediately knew something was wrong. Again. I searched for the little girl across the room by my bookshelf, and she wasn't there. I was relieved, but I still knew there was something off. Slowly, I realized that there was a light coming from the side of my bed, and it was that gray light. I turned my gaze downward, to the edge of my bed, and there were those eyes. The white goat eyes, and the sticky, matted bangs. Then, there was that smile. I could feel the weight of that glass of water on my bladder at that moment. The menacing, evil smile stretching ear to ear. I couldn't see the rest of her body. She was so close to me. All I could see was her eyes, looking up at me, and the enjoyment she was receiving from scaring the ever-living shit out of me. This time I screamed. I yelled my sister's name and threw the covers back over my head and cried. This wasn't right. I had done everything right. I went and got a glass of water. I shouldn't still be in this awful dream. I don't know how long I stayed under the covers. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next morning I woke to the morning sunlight streaming through my windows and birds chirping outside. It took a minute to remember what had occurred the night before. I immediately went to tell my sister what happened, and that I was very annoyed she didn't come to my rescue. After I told my sister, I came back into my room and noticed that glass of water had fallen onto the carpeted floor. So I did get a glass of water. I wasn't just dreaming. I must have knocked it over when I reacted so fearfully to the second approach from the girl. Anyways, that's what happened. I'm wondering if anyone else has had an experience with something similar. A ghost girl? My cousin suggested it was a demon in the form of a girl, feeding off of my fear. I'm not sure about that, but I'm sure of one thing. I never want to see her again. If you're interested, here's what I drew to get her out of my head. Mind you, she looked a lot more girl-like and less emaciated grown woman. My grandmother was a cop in Santa Maria in the late 70s up till the early 90s. A man calls in saying there's a 7-foot gray man at his door. So she responds and goes to check it out. The door is jammed. The man is screaming and she hears a loud buzzard. She slams the door open and the buzz is gone, and so is the man. There's blood everywhere. She calls for backup and runs around and calls his name. She hears what sounds like someone yelling, but someone is covering their mouth. She ends up finding the man tied up with piss everywhere. Investigators say that he was in that room for at least 4 hours. The man lives alone in the middle of nowhere, says he called the police about 5 hours ago and said that a cop was on their way. He reported seeing a 7-foot gray man with big eyes who did that to him. No footprints. No trace of any kind of invasion. My grandmother lost 4 hours somehow. The guy ended up taking his own life a few years later and leaving a note behind, warning my grandmother that, quote-unquote, they are after him, and thanking her for rescuing him. This is still the craziest story I've ever heard in my life. So I know this isn't exactly what you're looking for, but it still scared the living hell out of me, and it does involve the police. One night I was talking with my friend's mom. She was telling me about why she could never in a million years live in a trailer. Here's the story. I was about 5 years old and my parents moved us out into this trailer on about 2 or 3 acres of land. My room was at the far end of the house next to my sister's and was only about 20 yards away from the forest. Anyway, on a few nights, I kept hearing a scratching sound, almost like nails on a chalkboard. So I woke up my dad and he came in and verified that I was basically crazy and I was told to go back to bed. This went on for about 2 or 3 weeks until one night I was listening to the scratching when it suddenly stopped and my toy chest started moving away from the wall. I ran down the hall and got my dad, and he reluctantly came down to my room to check it out. When he flipped on the light, he saw a woman's head, looking like a crazed version of Gene Wilder, sticking through my wall where my toy chest used to be. This woman screamed at the top of her lungs, not like she was scared, like she was trying to scare him, and proceeded to pull at the trailer walls and try to crawl through the hole. He locked the door and called 911. The cops came out and arrested the woman, who was stuck halfway in the wall and cut all over the place. She had apparently escaped a mental facility 4 miles away and had decided to burrow into the house at night. TLDR, crazy woman scratches her way into a trailer and gets arrested. My uncle, who was a cop, told me about a time he responded to a 911 call from a lady who called 3 times claiming that the clouds were following her. I'm sorry, I just had to read that story because when I read it I was just laughing my ass off, and I thought some of you guys might enjoy it. I promise the rest of them will be scary. My dad is a police officer and he was called to an old castle-like house on the outskirts of town. The man who called in was telling him about his daughter who was acting strange. She was talking in a deep voice and speaking in swear words and high-level vocabulary. She was only about 10 years old. She was ultimately acting extremely creepy. My dad told the man, "I think you need an exorcist," and left that house immediately. He's been a police officer for 12 years and says that experience of that girl was the most scared he's ever been. This comes from a guy who has seen people blow their brains out with a shotgun or get decapitated by a train. We got a call of trespassers at an abandoned hospital during the daytime. There was an on-site security guard who kept it secure even though it was shut down. They swore they heard footsteps and talking on the second floor over the past few days. They locked down the entire perimeter and called us out there. There was no way out. We went in there with 6 officers and started from the 7th floor, systematically checking every single room down to the bottom floor. There was no power, so we were lucky it was still daylight and there were a lot of windows. It was an older hospital, so they left old CRT monitors from the 1980s and 90s in there. It was pretty eerie and reminded me a lot of the first scenes from The Walking Dead. We cleared down the floors from 7 to 5 no problem. Once we hit the 4th floor, it started getting really weird. This was the hospital's storage area. Instead of the big spacious rooms, it was super cramped and cinder block walls. There were chain link cages all over the place with old locks on it. It seriously looked like a horror movie prisoner area where they locked victims up. It was also pitch black. The hospital was so big that we worked in 2-man groups on each floor, but naturally split up as the floors opened up more. The 3rd floor was a mental ward area, so the padded walls and pitch dark rooms started to get me a little bit nervous. The 2nd floor was by far the worst, the surgery ward. There were no windows, and again it was pitch black. On top of that, there were large, eerie operating rooms all over the place. In the middle of some of the rooms, there were large metal slabs where they would operate on people. In adjoining rooms, they had huge pegboards where they stored the surgery power tools. How did I know it was power tools? They had marked the outlines of various drills, saws, and other painful-looking devices. It was kind of freaky thinking about how many people had died in those rooms when they couldn't save them. I was definitely nervous clearing those rooms solo in pitch black with only a flashlight. We eventually cleared every single room on every single floor and found nothing. The security guards swore up and down they always heard talking and footsteps down the halls though. We pretty much swore off that place and said not to call us anymore. TLDR, police enter scary hospital with possible ghosts. While working as a police officer in remote Australia, we were forced to move on an elderly Aboriginal man because the other locals had accused him of witchcraft and other things. We drove him to his township, approximately 1.5 hour drive away. The other locals were terrified of him as he was rumored to be a witch doctor. We dropped him off and warned him not to return to town for 3 days. We turned the vehicle around and drove back to town, flying probably 100 miles per hour. It took about 45 minutes to drive back, and upon our return, we find the same exact elderly Aboriginal sitting in the street. To this day, neither of us can explain it. Maybe the locals had every right to be scared. My uncle works for dispatch in my town, and he recently told my family one of the weirdest calls he's ever gotten. He says that he had received a call from a landline one night, and when he answered it, there was only static on the other end. This happened 2 more times. Finally, he calls the squad to go check out the address from the caller ID. When the cops got there and walked into the house, they immediately saw that there was a dead body. The person had been dead for 5 months. The craziest part about it was that there was no electricity or any other utility working from that house. So there's no way they should have been able to get those calls into dispatch. But if they hadn't, who knows how long that person's body would have stayed there. I got called to a residence at about 11 p.m. out in the boonies. This was in Wyoming, so the boonies are really the boonies. The call was about suspicious activity. When we get there, we're told by the family living there that there were very strange screams coming from a creek area about 1,000 feet out. And sure enough, waiting on the porch outside with them for a minute, I hear it. It's very hard to describe what it sounded like. It was like a woman in very severe distress, but higher pitched, and each scream lasted for about 10 to 15 seconds. It never sounded like it was saying anything. It just sounded like a cry of sheer terror, and it repeated again. We tell the family we're going to go investigate, so we just walked down the creek since it was nice out. We hear about 2 more screams, getting louder as we approach the creek. By now, we're both kind of freaked out. There are 2 possibilities. Someone is getting murdered or maimed in the creek bed, or it's a wild animal. As we approach the creek bed, we hear no screams for about 5 minutes. We search around and find nothing, yelling at the top of our lungs for somebody to come forward if they're there. Then we hear the exact same scream behind us, exactly from where we came from. We get about halfway back to the house, and the scream comes so loudly, it seems to be right next to us. We frantically shine our flashlights everywhere and find nothing. No eye glints of animals, no rustling of bushes, just silence. We trace our steps back, and the scream comes from around the creek again. This time it lasted about 30 seconds and was much louder than before. Our retreat becomes a little more hastened. By this time, we were both scared shitless and verified with the family to call us again if they heard it. They never called, and we got the hell out of there. I still don't know what it was. As an avid outdoorsman, I know no animal makes a cry like that, especially one that can move so stealthily without being spotted by flashlights. Something else that weirded me out was that it was completely silent while the screams were happening. During summer in Wyoming, there's always some type of ambient animal sounds. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, owls hooting, coyotes howling, etc. But there was nothing. Until we were leaving and the screams had stopped. Then a frog started croaking. It gives me the creeps just thinking about it still. Ex-UK officer here. A few years back, we were receiving phone calls from an elderly lady that lived alone. She was reporting seeing arms reaching through the walls in her living room and also hearing the sounds of screaming, wailing, and children laughing. I believe she was slightly confused and unfortunately might have been in the early stages of dementia, which naturally led everyone to believe she was imagining it. One day, we get a call from someone who is visiting her saying she has just seen arms come through the walls in the old fireplace. Officers turn up, and after a bit of digging around the fireplace, it turns out the teenage kids of the scummy family next door had somehow made or found a gap in the brickwork just up inside the chimney and were taunting this old lady by sticking their arms through and making ghost noises through the gap. They'd also been spraying deodorant into her house. It wasn't me who dealt with this, so unfortunately I don't have any details about what happened to the sickos doing it and whether or not they were prosecuted with anything. But let's just imagine the old lady eventually passed on, turned into a poltergeist, and then tormented them all into madness. Police officer here. I work in a large inner city district, very poor, lots of abandoned houses. We get a check the welfare run. 2 ladies had just gotten home. We're walking up to their house when they hear noises coming from the house just to the west of theirs. They walk over and claim to hear 2 kids, a boy and a girl, crying and screaming from the basement of the house. The house is vacant, a fact that the ladies knew. So they claim they start talking to the kids. The kids are screaming about how scared they are, and it's dark and they can't get out. So I get the dispatched run with a backup car. My dispatcher describes all these creepy elements in the run. I disregard my backup because I think this is a stupid run, a waste of time, and I don't want other officers' time wasted either. I arrive on the scene. The 2 ladies are flipping out. These ladies were black, which, coupled with the experience they had just had, made for some high drama histrionics at the scene. I thought maybe one of their kids had been kidnapped or some such. They were so wired. So I get them calmed down. I had to split them up because they kept feeding into each other's energy, and they'd all get wired up again. I was forced to ask for backup, which annoyed me to no end because this was still a bullshit run to me. So they repeat their stories, which matched up more or less perfectly. A common police tactic is to separate people when it comes to a criminal investigation. It wasn't intentional when I did it this time, but provided a little insight to their honesty on the occasion. So they were adamant about talking to the children, led me over to the basement window where they had a conversation with these children. Just a normal little rectangular basement window. They repeat the conversation they had with the children, said they talked to them for about 5 minutes. I listen at the window and there is nothing. To me, this run is still bullshit. I walk around the outside of the house, not really looking for anything specific, just getting a feel for the place. All the windows are secured, the doors are all locked up. No one is getting into this house, at least not without showing forced entry. I walk back to the window where the incident took place and notice one thing peculiar. The window is fogged over. There is condensation all over the window. It's summertime and that is a normal thing to see with houses with air conditioning. Except this house either didn't have air conditioning or it wasn't on. Thieves steal the copper coil, so whole house AC is rare. And on top of that, it was the only window with condensation on the whole house. No other basement window, nor any of the first or second floor windows had any condensation. I made the huge mistake of thinking out loud about this peculiarity with the window, because the two women flipped their shit again. A lot of, "Oh Lord, and help me Jesus" statements were being thrown out. So at this point, I haven't heard anything from inside the house. I have a strange looking window in a house which is locked down tight. Private property, secure house. I can't make entry without an exigent circumstance. But does the claim that women heard the children constitute an exigent circumstance? That's out of my pay grade. So I get a supervisor to come out, which annoyed me even further. He arrives. I explain to him the situation. He authorizes forced entry. Quick aside, I love kicking doors in. It rarely happens, but can be fun. And usually is quite easy. This front door is heavily secured. It takes about 4 kicks, but I was finally able to break it down. The city will reimburse the homeowner for the damages. So this house is probably 100 to 120 years old. It's got the musty, dusty smell going on. Old wood floors, plaster walls, very steep stairs, and no electricity. I go inside and I'll be honest. I was a little creeped out, but I don't believe in anything paranormal at all. 100% skeptic. So I'm expecting either a homeless guy or nothing. And it turned out that it was nothing. The house was very clean for its age. In the process of being worked on, drywall stacked on the floors. It was easy to check every nook and cranny, and there were no signs of anyone being there. I go back outside, advise the house is secure, no one inside, and I'm standing on the street in front of the house talking to my supervisor. We were just BSing about whatever, and while standing there, I look over to the house, and in the second floor window, which would be where the front bedroom was, I saw something cross by the window. I can't tell you what it was. It was dark and tall. Human in shape, adult human, but shadowy, or in the shadows. I'm not talking like a Slender Man type thing. I have no idea what it was. The only unsecured door to the house was still the front door I kicked in, and we were standing 20 feet away from it the whole time. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could have gotten past us and inside. So I take off running back inside the house. I'm convinced there's a squatter inside. I bound up the stairs and nothing. Nothing is there. Like I check everywhere again. Nowhere to hide. And that's it. I work dispatch. I received a 911 call from a frantic woman stating that there was a burglar in her home. The caller told me that she went out for a cigarette at night and when going back inside noticed the front door open a crack. She closed it and went to the backyard to have her smoke. It was there that she saw the basement light on through the window and saw what she described as a thin, tall white male with dark jeans, black jacket, scarf, and a ski hat with a pom-pom on top. Caller went back in her room and locked the back door. gathered her family in the bedroom, which was 8 to 10 feet from the hallway that leads to the basement. At this point, the police had been dispatched and arrived on the scene. Multiple surrounding towns responded to set up a perimeter. The back and the front were both covered, and the basement had bars on the windows, so all exits were covered. The police got the spare key hidden from the caller's directions that I relayed to them, entered the home and did an interior search which found no one in the home. The caller was very sure on what she saw and even could tell facial features. The caller had no history of mental illness and has never made a call like that before. She ended up taking her kids and staying with her family a few times over. Police cleared since there was no suspect and there'd be no way for them to get out if they were inside. On our next shift, one of the senior guys who had been there nearly 26 years told us he responded to a suicide of a young white male in that basement. Apparently, he had shot himself with his father's shotgun, which was in a case in the wall near where the caller described him standing and looking around. We all believed that she saw a ghost that night. My dad served as a police officer for 25 years. One night he gets a call from a woman who says her neighbor has made a pact with the devil. The woman calling is about 35 years old and totally a religious wacko. The neighbor she called about is about 75 years old at the time. My dad went over and knocked on the door, and this old lady answers. All happy, nice place decorated the same way it's been for over the past 50 years. She invites my dad in without even asking why he came, makes him some coffee, and asks how his day was. Naturally, at this point, my dad is wondering what the heck the call was about, but it came clear really soon. At some point, my dad realizes he isn't the only person she is talking to, and that she thinks her apartment is full of people. My dad thanks her for the coffee and she tells him to come back anytime. The whole time she was talking, he was writing down the names of the people she was talking to and does some research on her when he gets back. Turns out she was talking to family members who were all dead. She had a daughter, 3 sons, a brother, and a husband. All dead, and she had no family and no friends. She hadn't spoken to another person in years. Her groceries were delivered and she rarely left her apartment. Over the next 19 years, my dad personally took care of her. My sister and I came over all the time and just sat and talked with her. She even taught me how to cook. Over the years, she stabilized and stopped talking to her dead relatives. She just needed people to live with. She actually lived till she was 94 and died in the guest room of my parents' house, since it had become harder to take care of her from a distance as she got closer to the end. She was like a grandma for us. While this wasn't really a ghost story, I just thought it was worth telling. TLDR, not called about devil contacting old lady, turned into a great part of my whole family life, and one of the few moments that make me think humanity can actually be good. Back when I was working as a cop on a military base, I loved working night shift. I didn't deal with 99% of the bullshit that the day shift dealt with. And what little stuff we did deal with was usually really interesting. Well, most every building on a base is alarmed, and the alarms are tied right into the desks, so we know the instant they go off. When we get an alarm activation, we close the base and go check the building. Pull on all the doors, see if we can get in. If we can, we go into the building and secure it. Check all the doors and corners to see if someone set the alarm off. Well, one night, I was on patrol with my Alpha partner, and we get a call to respond to an alarm activation at the elementary school. So we go, secure the building, and call in that the building is all secure. No problem, keep patrolling. So about 15 to 20 minutes go by and we get another alarm activation. We get back out there and check, and now there is a maintenance door open that leads into a boiler roomish thing. Nothing in it, so we close it, lock it, and get out. Another 20 minutes and another alarm. We respond. All the doors are still locked and we can't get in. Maintenance door is locked. Call in the all clear. This time my buddy and I sit on opposite sides of the school and watch to see if someone is coming, and yanking the doors real hard to set the alarm off. We sit there and watch. Nothing happens, and right as we're about to leave, another alarm activation goes off, just as we're sitting there. We inform the desk that we'd like the building manager on site to help us secure the interior and to let us in. It's like 3 a.m. by now. Building custodian shows up and we start doing a walkthrough, checking all the classrooms and checking all the maintenance rooms, and that's when we see one of the maintenance doors open with the lights on in the room. Now this room is literally the size of a closet. We walk down there and look in. No one is in it, and that door is locked when it closes. We looked in there and we find a single footprint of a bare foot made of water, left foot as I recall, of a small child. Freaked the living hell out of us because no one reported a missing child, and the entire building was clear and still locked up. No one left, no one entered, and we checked every inch of that damn place, literally a 3-hour deep sweep including ceiling tiles. Freaked the ever-living shit out of us. And to this day, my partner refuses to go into that school. Speaking of which, schools are really spooky when they're empty. I was a 911 dispatcher for about 5 years out of school. One night I got a call from a lady at a residence in town. 911, what is your emergency? Is this the police? She breathed. She was freaking out. Heavy breathing, scared, shaking voice. I've taken many calls like this, and from the sound of her voice, this was not going to be a routine call. I sat up straight and my heart started to pump faster. Yes, ma'am, what is your emergency? There's someone in my house, she trailed off. Very breathy and genuine, but not loud and freaking out. Okay, are you located at... I go on to say her house address. Yes. I dispatch the cars to start heading over to the address, and I don't give a reason yet. Okay, do you know who this person is? Well, no, I don't. I think it's... I know this sounds so crazy. I think there's a ghost in my house. She begins to sob and sounds so freaking scared. There's noises, and I know there's a ghost right in the other room. I can hear it right now. At this time, the sergeant asked me the reason of the call and why I sent him and 2 other cars without explanation. Normally you'd send 1 car to something like that. It's suspicious activity, I told him. What activity? He demanded over the radio. A fair question. Sir, the caller is claiming there is someone in the house and she believes it to be a ghost. Silence on the air for about a minute. 10-4 is all he said. By the time they got there, the ghost was gone and the poor lady was a freaked out mess. And she kept apologizing for calling us. But it was real, she kept repeating. The officers later told me that her sincerity actually freaked them out a lot. And when they searched the house, guns drawn, even they were scared. Police officer here. One evening about 8 years ago, it was pouring outside, and we got a call from an elderly woman. She called in and said she was hearing footsteps in her house, and she thought there was a ghost inside, because she regularly heard the sound of someone walking upstairs, but she lived alone. We went just to check it out and make sure that everything was okay. She stayed on the line with 911 operator because she was frightened. About 3 minutes after she initially called in, she said that there was actually a man standing outside in her backyard, staring at her through a sliding glass door. Petrified, the woman froze in that spot and continued to stare directly at the man. For the next minute or two, she said that he was just standing there, still as could be, staring at her. Eventually, the man slunk off out of sight. When we arrived, about 12 minutes after the call first came in, we went to the front door. I remained in the foyer with the woman, and the other officer went to the backyard to see if the man was still hiding out or if there were any traces of him. I spoke with her for several minutes until the other officer returned. He said there were no traces of anyone having been in the backyard. We set off to do a quick sweep before we left to make sure the house was all clear. In her living room, the room that has the sliding glass door, we discovered a trail of mud and footprints inside the house. I asked the woman if she had been outside at all that day, or if anyone had been over to visit her. She said no, that she lived alone, and that no one had come by to visit. The woman was very old, probably around 85, and had very poor eyesight and was hard of hearing, as elderly people tend to be. The woman obviously had seen the man's reflection and mistakenly thought he was in front of her, on the other side of the glass, in her backyard. In reality, he had been standing only a few feet behind her in the same room while she had been talking to 911. Nothing was stolen, broken, or out of place, so we don't know what his intentions were. Who knows what would have happened had she not stayed on the line with the operator. I know it sounds like something out of a campfire story, but it was honestly one of the most unnerving and creepy experiences I've had while on duty. TLDR, responded to a call where an old woman thought there was a ghost in her house. She ended up seeing a man through her sliding door leading to her backyard. When we arrived, we discovered footprints indicating that the man had actually been inside of her house and she'd been looking at his reflection in the sliding glass door. My dad spent his whole career as a cop, and is the stereotypical straightforward bloke with it who has little time for anything you might label as paranormal. That said, he describes one event from about 20 years ago that he just can't explain. One late afternoon in autumn, he was patrolling with a colleague in Newbury, which is in Berkshire, United Kingdom, when they were radioed and asked to check out reports of a fight on the rural outskirts of town. Apparently sounds of an altercation had been heard coming from a field, of all places, and locals were concerned, but hadn't been able to describe or give any more info. When they got to the field in question, my dad and his colleague hopped a fence and headed inwards, not immediately seeing or hearing anything. It was gloomy and a little misty at ground level, but apparently just about enough light was left in the day to see there wasn't obviously anyone about. Apparently they gave the field a sweep and were on their way back to the car when, as my dad describes it, suddenly all went mental. Shouting, screaming, and the sounds of an almighty fight completely surrounded him. Even though he was standing in the field completely empty, apart from his colleague. He says 3 things in particular stuck with him. Firstly, that he was surprisingly not scared shitless at the time, just sort of completely confused. And secondly, the look on his colleague's face that basically said, WTF, you're hearing this too, right? And finally, that after a short time, the sounds just stopped and they made their way back to the car and called in to say nothing was going on. When pushed, he admits that he felt like he was in the middle of something significant, and that he thinks he felt and not just heard the fighting around him. And with hindsight, he was more frightened after the event than at the time. He would never describe this as paranormal himself, but to me, this always sounded like a replay type of event that people talk about, and subsequently learning about the Civil War history of the specific area in question backs this up, for me at least. So this happened about 5 years ago while I was 9 months pregnant. I was Christmas shopping at the mall with my then 7 and 15-year-old daughters one Saturday night in a very safe city with very low crime rate. There was an Applebee's connected to the mall, and we ended our shopping pretty late, and the mall stores were starting to close. So I took my kids to the connected Applebee's for a late dinner. We finish up eating at about 10 p.m. and leave out the Applebee's entrance into the practically deserted parking lot with shopping bags in tow. As we got to the car, I was in the middle of maneuvering the shopping bags on my arms to find my keys, when a 50-ish-year-old, crusty-looking guy starts walking up from somewhere in the parking lot with shaggy gray-white hair and a faded flannel shirt and old jeans. I noticed him briskly approaching when he was about 40 feet away, and he said, "This is a stick-up. Give me all your money." My blood ran cold, and I stared at him owlishly and shaking and said, "What?" He then said he was just kidding and came up and stood right next to my daughters, who were standing on the other side of the car waiting for me to unlock the car to let them in. He then starts making small talk with me and my girls. He's asking things like if they were being good girls for Santa, how old they were, if we got all our Christmas shopping done, what kind of things did we get, etc. He didn't seem drunk, high, slow, or mentally challenged at all. He was very coherent and seemed of sound mind. Mind you, I was a heavily pregnant woman, alone with my 2 daughters in a mostly deserted parking lot at 10 o'clock at night, who was being approached by a stranger who came and stood right next to my kids on the other side of the car, just shooting the breeze, talking to me and my kids with his hands in his pockets and occasionally looking over his shoulder. I didn't want to aggravate him, so I was politely conversing with him and trying to look calm and nonchalant, while trying to disguise my frantic hands digging inside my giant purse for my car keys. This exchange went on for a couple minutes while he periodically kept looking over his shoulder. I was silently panicking and trying to politely keep the situation from escalating by calmly and nonchalantly talking to him, while also trying in vain to find my damn car keys to get us out of here. They were in there hiding good. I felt that at any moment he was going to pull a knife or gun or rob me, and my kids were right next to him, away from their mother on the other side of their car, and I couldn't find my fucking car keys to get my kids into the safety of the car. He kept trying to engage them in conversation, and I could see that my oldest daughter was a little weirded out, and she kept glancing at me to gauge my assessment reaction to the situation. Kids often tend to not recognize potential danger when they are with their parents, since they see us as their protectors, and being that he was only talking and acting friendly, and I was doing my best to stay calm, they were oblivious to the alarming situation we all were in, and being 9 months pregnant, and that I was no match to this full-grown man, especially if he was hiding a weapon on him. While still desperately digging for my keys, I tried to politely give him hints that the conversation was over by saying things like, "It was nice chatting with you, but I gotta get these kids to bed," and "It was nice meeting you," and telling my girls to say that it was nice meeting him too. My polite attempts to get this guy to leave wasn't working because he kept sidestepping my attempts and asking them what their favorite school subjects are and how nice young ladies they were, etc. All while I was struggling with the shopping bags and digging in my giant cluttered purse for my car keys. My outgoing 7-year-old was completely oblivious to how not okay this situation was, because the creep was being quote-unquote friendly and because of the whole "I'm with mommy so I'm safe" child mentality. So she started to talk about what she picked out for daddy for Christmas, and started enthusiastically talking about kid stuff and asking him if he knew what Minecraft was and stuff, and keeping this creep from leaving us alone by keeping him engaged in conversation. They didn't realize that I was becoming desperate to get them the hell out of there. Then, I suddenly felt this sinking feeling of dread when I realized that I may have lost my keys in the mall, and that we were stuck outside with this strange man who kept looking over his shoulders and was showing no signs of walking away, and I was thinking that he was waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. All he had to do was grab one of my girls and threaten their life, knowing it would make me do whatever he wanted as long as he wouldn't hurt them. I started to feel my adrenaline start to spike, and my heart and stomach started doing flip-flops, and I felt like at any moment shit was going to go down as the gravity of realizing that there were no other people or witnesses around, that we were totally alone with him, and at that moment the odds were stacked against us and that this would be his chance. Then he all of a sudden was all like, "Okay, it was nice talking with you. See you later," and walked off in the same direction as to which he came. It wasn't until then I found my car keys and unlocked the car and told my kids to get in fast, and I got in too and locked the door and started the car and drove the hell out of there. My 15-year-old lightheartedly and jokingly said, "Okay, that was weird," and laughed. I was overwhelmed with relief, and then I was confused over what just had happened. I thought to myself, why the hell would a guy of seemingly sound mind think it would be totally acceptable to go out of his way just to approach a woman and her kids in a deserted parking lot late at night just to chit-chat? But being that nothing bad happened, I brushed it off and joked about it too. When we got home, my husband greeted us and asked us how the shopping went. And I said it all went well, and my 15-year-old told him what happened in the parking lot and how weird it was and was kind of joking about it. I started joking too, saying how I was mentally having a panic attack while trying to look calm. And I started making fun of myself by telling my husband how I was attempting to inconspicuously rummage through my purse to find my car keys. My husband went completely white, and I acknowledged his horrified look of alarm, and I assured him that, albeit creepy, the guy was just talking and eventually left on his own. Now, my father-in-law is a retired sheriff deputy, and my husband went through police academy training after graduating high school. He decided to go to business school instead of becoming a cop, and being that the knowledge he gained from that, plus growing up with a cop for a dad, I found out why my husband looked absolutely horrified when I told him the details. What my husband told me completely rattled me to the bone. My husband told me that he was 100% sure that the reason why the guy was hanging around us and chit-chatting was because he was waiting for me to unlock the car. And the reason why he was standing next to our kids was because once I unlocked the car and the kids started to get inside, he was most likely going to force himself into the car with the kids and hold a knife or gun to them to gain leverage on me to force me to cooperate, knowing that I wouldn't abandon my kids, which would force me to get in the car with them and do whatever he wanted me to do, which most likely would be to drive to a remote location and do God knows what. And being that he wasn't wearing a mask suggests that his intentions were to also leave no witnesses to identify him. I then remembered that he was positioned by the backseat passenger door, where my 7-year-old was standing by waiting to get in. My husband then told me that the most likely reason why the guy ended up leaving was because it took so long for me to find my keys, and the longer it took, the more anxious and spooked it made him. And that the whole time, while I was desperately trying to find my car keys, it must have been some sort of divine intervention, keeping them hidden in my purse, which ended up saving us from potentially being abducted. Hey guys, I know it's been a while. It's been a really crazy year for me, but I'm back, and I'm going to be pumping out as much content as I possibly can. But I need your help. Ever since I started posting shorts, the algorithm started reducing my reach on my long-form content. So I'm going to make a second shorts channel called Dr. Hans Shorts. I'll link it in the description so you can follow. But any engagement, comments, likes, shares, it's all going to be able to help to get my reach back from what the algorithm did to me. Thanks again. Let's get into the stories. This happened in 2019. I was in my second year of college and living in a townhome, about a 10-minute walk from campus. I lived with 2 other girls at the time, but they were all back at their parents' house for the holiday. I work in healthcare and was working Christmas this year. A little bit of a backstory. There used to be 4 of us living there, but one girl had moved out due to issues with her boyfriend. He was a jackass who abused her kindness on allowing him to stay there. He was only supposed to come every so often, but basically ended up living there. We told her she needed to kick him out after an incident with him one night. after he got physical with her and verbally abusive with the rest of us. She wouldn't listen, and we told her we would have to talk to the landlord then. Long story short, she ended up moving out and left on bad terms with us. On another side note here, I have been in a physically and mentally abusive relationship before, so I understand how things may have been going for her. I tried my best for 2 years at that point to help her open her eyes to the abuse and to get her away from him. At this point, it was affecting everyone, and we didn't feel safe with him there, so she moved out. Okay, back to the story. It was Christmas Eve, and I worked the next day, so I was getting ready for bed. Locked the doors, turned the lights off, and went downstairs where my bedroom was. I was scrolling on TikTok for about an hour, and it was technically Christmas Day at this point because it was past midnight. And that's when I heard what sounded like the chairs in the kitchen move. The kitchen is directly above my bedroom. I thought maybe I was hearing the neighbors next door as we share the same walls, and sometimes they can be loud. But I remember one of them texting me and asking me to bring in a package they were expecting while they were all gone at home. The noise was short-lived, and so I just brushed it off. Next thing I know, my bedroom door is being opened slowly. In this moment, I get a flashback and remember my second grade teacher telling us about the time someone broke into her house and she acted as if she were asleep, so if they were just there to rob her, they wouldn't feel the need to hurt her if she saw them. But my freaking phone screen is lighting up my scared jaw-drop face, so I can't act like I'm asleep. Where I'm laying in bed faces directly to the door, so we're just looking right at each other. So there I was, laying in my bed, shitting myself, while this guy has one foot in my bedroom with the door cracked open. It felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably more like 10 seconds of us looking at one another. He slowly takes his foot out and closes my door. I sit there, just in complete and utter shock. I couldn't make out what he looked like as my eyes were adjusting to the dark again from the phone screen. All I could see was a backwards baseball cap. I knew I had to call the police, but my anxious ass knew if I called, it would alert my parents' phones that I had called. Me being dumb as hell was like, well, I don't want to make him worry. Also, I was scared he might still be somewhere in the house. I didn't know what he would do if he heard me call. So I text the guy that I was seeing at the time and tell him some random guy just broke into my house and came into my room. He snapped me out of it and told me to call the police, and so I did. The dispatcher asked me if I felt comfortable to go and lock the front door for them, so they didn't have to break it down, and I told her no way. I don't care if the door is broken, I'm not going there alone. A couple minutes later, I see flashlights shining through my window. I hear the police knocking at my door and announcing themselves. They got in and asked me where I was. I came out of my room and they came and got me. They told me to go wait on the back porch while two of them searched the house and one stayed with me. It was like that shit you see in the movies where they have their guns and turn the corner with their partner and everything. They didn't find anyone, and I said nothing looked like it had been taken. They even tried to get fingerprints but were unsuccessful. They then started asking me questions and informed me that the back door was unlocked and had no signs it had been broken. I told them I locked it. Luckily, the guy I was talking to stayed with me that night, but I still couldn't sleep. I kept having to go check every inch of the house over and over. I placed chairs under the door handles for the front door, the back door, and my bedroom. The next day, I informed our landlord and she refused to come out and change the locks. And she never ended up changing them for the rest of the time we lived there. Every time I go to bed now, I triple check that all the doors have been locked. Doesn't matter where I am. I have a dog now and he helps my anxiety of intruders, as well as a recent purchase of a Ring doorbell. I believe it was our old roommate's boyfriend. I think they may have made an extra key for him because he was basically living there. But I don't understand why he didn't do anything to me the house, or our belongings. If it were some random, I don't know why they wouldn't have done what they intended, and that could be many different possibilities. I don't know what their intentions were that night, but to the man who broke into my house on Christmas Eve, let's not meet again. I am a 26-year-old female and was sitting down with my fiancé talking about creepy things that happened to us as kids. That's when I remembered this. I was about 8 or 9 years old, and my neighborhood would do this Christmas house celebration, where every house would do something different. I grew up in a very quiet, secure, everybody knows everybody part of Florida. Well, it was all the neighborhood kids and myself playing outside while the parents drank and did festive holiday stuff. As we were playing, this car pulled up and asked if one of us could show them the pool. For reference, my house was in the back of the neighborhood, and to get to it, you had to pass the clearly visible pool. This was an older couple that looked like they'd be around 50, I'd say. My brain didn't really register the threat. I was a very kind and naive kid, so I offered to go with them and show them the pool. Right before I was to get in the car, I finally remembered to tell a parent. So me and the other kids ran inside and got my mother. Upon hearing what was going on, she and the rest of the adults ran outside, and the car with the couple was gone. It's crazy to think about now that I was almost likely kidnapped on Christmas, and who knows what would have happened to me. So, to the couple in the car, if you're still alive, let's not meet again. I'm living in a very rural small village with maybe 10 to 15 houses, but it's close to the highway. You can drive there within maybe 5 minutes, and also about 10 minutes away from the town. If you cross the street, it just takes you about a 10-minute walk to reach the forest. In the afternoon, my partner and I decide to go for a little digestive walk, as we were really stuffed from all the food. It was about 5 o'clock and already dark when we left. We had a big bright LED flashlight with us. I also took my camera and my flash, as I love taking pictures of the nature at night. We decided to walk on a little country road towards the forest and then turn right, following a small gravel cycle track close to the forest border, which connects our village and the next, maybe 15 to 20 minute walk between the villages. In the middle part of the track, you have to walk through a small bit of forest. It's rather dark and the trees are very high and quite dense. When we entered, I saw a flashlight reflecting on something and recognized a car being parked there on the side of the track, close to the trees. This struck me as odd, as cars are not allowed to drive there and the path is very narrow and hidden, so I was a bit cautious. My partner pointed the light inside of the car and it seemed to be empty. I also noticed the windows were frozen, so it must have been parking there for a while. A bit in front of the car, I spotted a tree with an intriguing structure. I asked my partner to point the flashlight towards it, so I could focus better and photograph it with my flash. After I took a few images, my partner told me, there's someone standing behind us in the middle of the road. He's looking at us. Nobody was following us the whole way. I kept looking around and behind us occasionally, because at this time in the evening and close to the border of the forest, there are boars sometimes, and it is mating season, so they are more aggressive than usual. Indeed, there was a man standing behind us, staying out of the flashlight's reach. He wasn't saying anything, just standing there and facing us. At first I thought maybe he was just startled, as it may seem a bit weird if someone's just taking photos around your car. It was not even legal to drive on that path with a car. I decided to get up and confront him from a distance, explaining to him that I was just taking photos of the tree. He didn't react and still just stood there. then went on to ask him if he needed some light, and he replied that this wasn't necessary. It was odd, but I was still calm, sure about there being a normal explanation for his behavior. Nonetheless, my partner and I decided to just GTFO and follow the path leading to the next village. It was maybe 5 to 7 minutes until we reached it. I remember the letters on his license plate, not the numbers though, unfortunately, and Googled it. And it turned out that he was from a city about 6 hours away from our village. Mind you, the country I live in is in a very strict lockdown right now, so you're only allowed to travel, even by car, if you have very urgent reasons. After we reached the first lantern of the next village, we looked back and observed the car driving a bit out of the forest, turning around and going back inside. I was able to see that he parked there again and turned the lights off. He didn't leave the forest. We then went home on a much longer way than initially intended, as I didn't want to go back there for obvious reasons. Our flashlight battery died on the way and my phone battery was low, so I didn't want to call the police back then. But I called them as soon as I arrived home and gave them all the details. Big regret that I didn't memorize the whole license plate, but it was just so surprising that I seriously didn't think about it. Also, it occurred to me as really strange when I thought about the frozen windows, and that he couldn't have possibly walked behind us the whole time, plus having no light and not responding. He did seem to be sneaking up on us when I sat down to take the photo. I think I was very lucky to have my partner, the camera, and the bright light with me. I don't want to imagine what could have happened if I was alone. So, creepy guy sneaking around the forest, let's not meet. Update. When I told my housemate, she theorized that he may have been spying on the houses very close to the forest border, as you can easily look into the backyards without being seen. You have to walk a bit up the hill and further about 5 minutes. I think this is likely the case. I had the thought of photographing the car when I entered the forest part of the path, but somehow I felt unwell about it and decided to not do it, despite it being an interesting scene. In hindsight, I believe this saved me, as he must have hidden behind the trees close by the car and the forest entrance. If he was really planning a burglary, or worse, dumping a body, I think it's not unlikely that he may have attacked me if he realized I had a potential photo of his car with a recognizable license plate. Also, I went back and found a tape marking on one of the trees. A very small hideout, more to store things than to sit in, as well as some cut off part of a backpack. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time. We could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and would likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers, we discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, we hid from trains. At night we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our stand-by me trips. Well, nostalgia and a beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave a what the hell and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in the yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet in the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on the top of the short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk and we just decided to ring up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the church. And the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, can you believe this shit? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in the movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that it covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us on the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it. We walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around. But I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. Okay, first let me say I debated about posting this here because I may be overreacting about a few weird things that have happened in the last couple weeks here at my house. But then I decided to go ahead and post it anyways and see what y'all think about it. And please tell me if I'm overreacting. I won't be offended at all if anyone tells me I'm being silly. First off, our house has a basement crawl space that's only accessible from outside, through a door directly underneath my bedroom window and about 10 feet from the bottom of the steps leading up to the back deck. It's a fairly large space, dirt floor and concrete walls, clean and plenty big enough for a grown man to stand up in. Until recently, it was half full of junk, mostly from our kitchen renovation, like paint cans and equipment and extra floor tiles and such, and I had a padlock on it. We asked our yard guy to do some extra work that included cleaning it completely out, and when it was empty, we didn't bother putting the lock back on it. It has a sliding bolt on it that keeps it closed, in addition to the little loop thingy that you put the padlock on. So we just slid in the bolt and called it good. There was absolutely nothing in it, so no point in locking it. A couple weeks ago, my boyfriend was out on the back deck emptying the recycling bins and noticed the door was open. Someone would have had to open it. The sliding bolt is a bit rusty, and it wouldn't easily come open and certainly wouldn't have opened on its own. He went and checked it out. Nobody there. Still completely empty. He thinks, well, okay, someone was poking around and didn't find anything interesting, but he did tell me about it and reminded me to keep the doors locked when he isn't home. A few days after that, I had the dog outside and he ran straight to the door and started sniffing and scratching at it, and I noticed it was slightly open again. I opened it, went inside and walked around, but there was nobody there. Let me add here that we have a lot of trees and wildlife on our property, including raccoons and groundhogs in addition to tons of squirrels. We have one huge oak tree that overhangs the roof, covering the master bedroom, so it's nothing unusual to hear squirrels and other animals on the roof with their little pattering feet and scratching sounds. Yesterday, I was here alone, laying in bed reading a book, the house completely silent. Usually the dog will lay in bed with me, but he was fidgety acting. He was pacing and just acting weird. I was hearing the usual late afternoon squirrels or whatever on the roof. But then I hear a noise that is clearly the crawl space door creaking open. It is directly underneath the window to my right, so I stand up and creep over to the window, crack the shades a tiny bit to peek out, and I see a guy staring up the steps to the back deck, having just exited the crawl space. I immediately said, "Oh fuck no," dropped the shades and headed up the hall directly to the door he was heading for to confront him. At that same moment, my dog went nuts, barking and beat me to the door, but he was nowhere in sight when I got there. I only saw him through the window for a second. I only saw him from the back as he was heading up the steps. He was wearing a baseball cap, so I couldn't even have seen what color hair he had. I'm guessing my dog scared him away, but what the fuck was he doing walking up to my porch in broad daylight with someone obviously home? He hadn't planned on knocking on the door. And no one would knock on that door anyway. People come to the front to knock, not walk all the way out the back in the trees in the backyard. I waited a few minutes, then got my pepper spray out of my purse and went out to invest in being. Not even in self-defense. And rat shot won't do much more than scare someone with the noise of the gunshot. He was highly pissed at me that I went by myself into the basement to check things out. But I'm more angry than frightened. I don't know if I'm overreacting. That just because someone had been inside the basement a few times, I automatically assumed that the man I saw was responsible and meant harm. I'm fairly certain he did come from there, though, because I definitely heard the door open just seconds before I saw him on the steps. With it locked up now, though, if someone had been routinely in and out, that will stop. Like I said, I just don't know if I'm freaking out over nothing. I'm keeping my doors locked just in case. So this didn't happen to me. It happened to my friend who got a new house, and he told me to share it. It's a little chilling. My friend had gotten a good deal on his first house, something like $100,000. Really good for a small house. However, as soon as he moved in, something was off. He lived there with his girlfriend. The first encounter with the noises was when they were inside the house, moving in. My friend was going up to the attic to store some extra stuff that wouldn't fit to pawn off later. As he was going up the ladder to the attic, he heard a scrambling noise. He went up, and a terrible smell hit him. It was a 20-year-old house, and he thought nothing of it. After he went down, he heard something in the attic. He figured it was a rodent, and after a few weeks, called an exterminator. The exterminator went up and found a bunch of cocaine, heroin, every drug you can think of just sitting there. He called the cops and they arrived to search the house. My friend was cuffed, the house was searched, the attic was searched. They found a pipe in the corner leading to a crawl space that they didn't know of. The cops went back downstairs and searched the house. They eventually found nothing. My friend took it upon himself to break the base underneath the house. He found a living space with his stuff from the attic, and a guy with long brown hair, a torn hoodie, and my friend's extra shoes. He yelled for the cops, who were still out front, and got the fuck out of there. The cops wanted the man to put his gun down, and he did. They then told him to get in cuffs. He walked over to the hole my friend had broke, and accepted his fate. He was charged with illegal drug trafficking and sentenced to a year in prison. It still creeps my friend out, even though he moved the heck away from that place a few months ago, to know that some drug dealer was hiding in his house for months and with a gun. I have a phobia that goes by a few names: scopophobia, ophthalmophobia, the fear of being watched. I have this weird compulsion. Whenever I see a doorway, a window, or virtually any surface that I believe someone could hide behind, I imagine a face peering out at me, staring. I imagine what I would do. What could I do? You will soon find out why I have this phobia. On to the story. I'll try my best to remember all the details, but my mind has repressed a lot of it. Around June of 2016, my mother and I were living in a small apartment. There was no basement or attic, obviously, but there was one tiny crawl space in the closet floor of my bedroom. I never looked in it. I suppose some people would be overwhelmed with curiosity, but my mind had already imagined all the worst case scenarios. I decided to leave whatever dead bodies and ghosts were down there for whoever rented after us. It was a nice apartment, small but perfect for the two of us. We lived there for a few peaceful months until the noises started. It was nothing extreme, just the odd bump in the night, and particularly scratching. My mom just brushed it off as rats in the walls. As long as they stayed in there, I saw no reason to get rid of them. A week or two later, I had already grown used to the noise. It became almost comforting in a way. After all, I never really liked silence. That is, until I awoke one night to a different noise. A rolling noise, eerily similar to the sound my closet made when I opened it. I peeked my eyes open and looked over, but I couldn't make out anything in the dark. I thought maybe I saw something move, but I was well aware of how the mind plays tricks on you in the dark. There's only one way to find out. I turned on my lamp. I feel like crying just writing this out. It's been almost a year since I've had to recall this night. When I turned on the light, I expected to just see a closet full of coats. But what I saw was much, much worse. It was an eye. Not just an eye, but the entire half of someone's face, barely visible in the tiny crack he had opened. He didn't even react to being caught. No smile, no fear, just watching. My heart has never beat faster than it did that night. I wish I screamed or maced him or anything, but I just stared back, frozen in time until I couldn't hold it anymore. I began sobbing, loudly. I think I tried to say something along the lines of, "What do you want?" But it was garbled by my crying. He opened the door more. I could now see his entire body, which I don't care to describe as I've spent 2 long years trying to forget that face. Shh. I lost my breath at that. Hearing him made it real. I couldn't pretend this was some fucked up hallucination anymore. At this, I sat up and pressed my back against the wall. "It's okay, Natalia," he said it so cheerfully. It gives me chills just remembering it. This is when I finally had the courage to run out of the room. This creep knew my name. My fucking name. My mom, still half asleep while she called the police, thought I had imagined it. Of course, by the time the police got there, he was already long gone. All that was left of him was the damn crawl space. I still never looked inside, though writing this now I kinda wish I did. Having some sort of proof of this would, I don't know, comfort me, because at least y'all would know I'm not crazy. Apparently he had been living in there for how long, I don't know, but the officers who first arrived on the scene said that there were tally marks inside the crawl space. I didn't want to know how many. I didn't want to know whether he was marking days or weeks. I just wanted to leave that fucking apartment, and we did. The police never found him, not for certain. They thought they found a homeless man who matched his description, but he was apparently unresponsive. I always thought they didn't take it all that seriously. They just thought he was a squatter, even after I told them that he knew my name. They thought that given how long he had seemingly been squatting, he had probably just heard my name through the floorboards. Since that night, he has been the face I always see when there's an open door or closet. It's grown more distorted as time goes on, but I can always make out a part of his pursed lips, as if he's still shushing me, even now. It's gotten easier with time, but I don't think it will ever leave me completely. Anyway, I guess we didn't actually have rats. Hey guys, just wanted to take a quick second and say thank you for all the likes, comments, subscribes, the feedback, and kind messages. I really appreciate it, and it encourages me to keep making more content for you guys. I know originally I said I was going to post about 100 videos this year, but I feel more motivated to go even beyond that because of you guys. So if you're new to the channel or haven't done so yet, please hit that subscribe button and that notification bell to get updates on my newest videos. Thanks again. This past Monday, my coworkers and I returned to our hotel from a day of work out in the field. Rebecca and I walked to our rooms, and as we stood outside our rooms, I opened mine and I saw someone in the bathroom. I said, "Hello?" Nobody answered. My first instinct was that it was a cleaning lady in there for some reason. Then I saw my bag with my clothes in her hands. I said to my coworker, "There's a woman in my room." Then I asked the woman, "What are you doing with my stuff?" It gets a little fuzzy here because I can't remember everything I said and what she said, but she kept mumbling about how her key still worked, how it still worked, and that's how she got in. I was in shock, and she was obviously very flustered, having been caught mid-robbery. She dropped my bags and fumbled around with her purse in a white plastic bag. By this time, my coworker was behind me, watching all the insanity unfold. This woman was scrambling and walking towards the door, and I said, "What's in the bag?" thinking it is probably my stuff, and so she said, No, it's just my things, I'll show you." And so she did. I looked and I didn't see anything of mine, and so, since I'm obviously in shock at this time, I let her leave. I went into my room and it's been ransacked. I did a quick look around to see if anything had been taken. All of my electronics were still there. Then I went into the bathroom and I saw my underwear, my bikini, and my clothes shoved into my own bags randomly. Even my passport was shoved in there. Then I looked on the counter and I saw that she got into my medication. I'm not sure what was going on through my head at that moment other than I wanted it back. So I ran out the door to go find her. I ran to the laundry room downstairs and out to the sides of the hotel, and I didn't see her. I realized I was never going to find her, so my coworker and I went down to the lobby to tell them what happened, and then we called the police. We went back up to my room to wait, and I noticed that there's still a metal bat on my bed, a little larger than one of those novelty wooden bats you can get at a baseball game. But there's also a flashlight on the end. She must have left it behind in her hurry. She also left behind a necklace that must have fallen out of her bag when she was scrambling with mine. I was mostly freaking out at this point because I thought she had gotten away with my medication that I need. The police got there and took our statements and looked around the room as well. One thing that I noticed was that there were bits of drywall in the sink, and I pointed that out to the cops, but none of us really knew where it came from. We started looking at the door and the windows to see if she pried her way in somehow, but there was nothing. So we kind of just went with the idea that she had a spare key or something. even though the hotel front desk was adamant that there was no way that could be. The officer that came brought 2 more officers as backup because they thought this woman might still be in the vicinity. But after our statements were taken, there was nothing else they could really do, so they left. I sat down to finally make some calls to tell people, and as I'm on the phone, I'm thinking about the drywall in the sink, and it still didn't make any sense to me. So I'm on the phone and looking at the drywall and the mirror on the wall right above it, and then it hit me. I got my coworker and asked her to help me pull at this mirror on the wall, and we took the mirror down, and there's a hole there just big enough for a desperate junkie to squeeze through. I asked Brian and Rebecca if I should call the cops again to let them know that I found this, and my boss said, "There's still 2 cop cars in the parking lot." So I went down to tell them, and the female cop kind of rolled her eyes, but the young guy said, "I'll come and check it out." They both came back up, looked in the hole, and found a pillow, blankets, cigarettes, clothes, toothbrushes. This woman had been living in the wall behind my mirror for God knows how long. She had access to me and my room at all times. I know this might be hard to picture, but there was a crawl space about 2 feet wide in between the 2 rows of rooms. One of the officers called the original officer to come back and take a picture of this. She explained to him what was going on, and all I hear over the radio is, "No fucking way." He comes back, takes pictures, and is just as mind blown as the rest of us. Obviously, we packed up and left immediately. What's even crazier is she has probably been there a long time. The last time we stayed at this hotel, I would randomly smell cigarette smoke, and I assumed someone was smoking in their bathroom when it was traveling through the vents. But nope, a junkie was smoking just on the other side of my mirror. She had access to other rooms too. The holes in the walls were from a renovation, and the hotel hadn't properly patched and just covered them up with mirrors. She could have been hanging out in people's rooms when they were gone. Anyway, this was insane, and I'm taking a little time off. Here's a photo of what that hole looks like. As a female who's been playing World of Warcraft for 15 years now, I've met a lot of creeps, but only a few who made me feel genuinely unsafe. To start off, I've always had a laptop since I was in high school. A luxury back then. I worked hard to earn enough to buy one. My mom almost took my money I earned for drugs, but luckily money I made in tips were in cash, so it was easier to hide it from her. At first, my mom was mad I bought myself a laptop, but she soon forgot like everything. My dad could care less, and my older brother already had his own. So I started playing World of Warcraft with him at 14, and back then girls were unheard of. So I got the usual creeps who usually backed off after hearing my age, or they were young too, but not this guy. This guy loved that I was underage. I was about 16, and he used to creepy guys at this point, no longer a noob at the game or fending off the creeps. It was no surprise a new guy in the guild started hitting on me. Now, I was 16, dumb, young, and horny, and stupid, but I knew I wasn't going to find love on WoW, where you knew no one in real life. Plus, I had the ultimate crush on a guy I couldn't have because he was my brother's best friend. But in my mind back then, I only wanted him. So it was easy to turn guys down despite being desperate as hell for one guy, lol. But that all changed after my brother's friend went off to college. I had a part-time job with my brother's friend, but girls at work surrounded him, and I became demoralized I'd never find love. Cue 19-year-old guy on WoW who made me feel wanted. I had a camera phone so I could send and post pictures at that age, and back then I mostly used Facebook, MySpace, and PhotoBucket. I lost a lot of weight my sophomore year, so I posted confidently bikini pics and sexy pictures, thinking I'd lure the attention of my brother's friend who was 19. So when this guy who was also 19 liked me, it didn't faze me. He looked the part in his photos, and his younger brother was my age, so I thought he was extremely attractive in his photos and even proved it was him in his pictures by holding items I asked for. He started paying my WoW subscription, which in the long run I realized it was all to get my home address and real name. I was so stupid and heartbroken over my brother's friend. Years of teaching myself online safety and the ability to be strong against flirts was all but lost in the fog. We'd talk for hours on Ventrilo and he'd make me feel pretty. I was completely blinded by this point. He sent me gifts and I didn't even question how he had my address. Then he offered to drive and pick me up, as only then did I suddenly get cold feet. I had a good friend on WoW, someone my brother met at PAX and joined the guild and is still one of my best friends to this day, though we both aren't fond of my older brother. He's 6 years older than me, but never creeped on me, was more like the protective brother I lacked. Well, at least till I was 24 and single for the first time did we hook up, lol, but that's because we were friends for so long. But the distance led to it not turning into a relationship. He caught on to it through my conversation and was my words of wisdom in a time I was lacking any of my own. He saw something was fishy when I couldn't. I told my friend I was scared to meet him because, dumb teenager logic, I thought he would not like me. My friend chimed in and said I shouldn't meet anyone off the internet at my age. I told him about the gifts and I swear I've never been scolded like this in my life. Not even by my own parents, but he always cared like that. He wondered why I would give my address to someone I never met, and the expensive gifts I got were not something the average 19-year-old could afford. None of this ever clicked for me, of course, because I was lonely and trying to prove, I don't know, to myself, my crush or something, that I could get a boyfriend. Like that, I told the guy it wasn't wise to meet in person, and my quote-unquote parents said I wasn't allowed to. That's when it went dark. At first it was pestering over and over, guilting me over gifts he gave me and encouraging me to defy my parents. While he kept bothering me, it never once occurred to me he'd lose his shit. While my friend was worried shitless about the guy having my address, going as far to drive the 11 hours to my house and explain the situation to my dad as I refused to tell him out of fear of getting in trouble at the time, all while taking his spring break in my state instead of his own with his friends. There's a reason he's still one of my best friends. He has a little sister of his own as well, and she's my age, so his protective nature is natural. Eventually, he made me block the guy, and that was that. This guy was pissed off. He'd go on different accounts to accuse me of gold digging and using him. Luckily, my friend was smart enough and had the foresight to change my WoW password, and even paid for my account for me taking this guy off it entirely, as one of the guy's threats was to delete my account. But it didn't end there. It got worse, as he'd consistently find ways to message me and tell me how horrible I was. Till about a month had passed. I was walking home from school, about 2-mile walk in the wealthy suburbs of New England, which I'd done for years. Many kids did it, as it was a very safe town with no crime in it or surrounding towns. Without a second thought, I took off with my 100-pound backpack. Maybe that's a bit overestimated, lol. Put my headphones in and started my 20-minute walk home. It was so cold, so I had earmuffs over my headphones, only drowning out sound more. I swear, if I could talk to myself as a kid, I'd probably just slap myself for stupidity, because the World of Warcraft guy knew I walked home every day as I talked about it. He knew my address, and I never thought twice. I was on the back roads walking home, and honestly, it's easy to map from my school to home, as it was a pretty straightforward walk with only one turn. At the halfway point to my home, in between songs, I heard a vague crunching sound of tires rolling over gravel on the road slowly. I turned around to see a tinted black car that you couldn't see much of the person in the front. I jogged out of the driveway I was standing in front of, assuming it was wanting to turn in. But it didn't turn in. The roads were dead, and it didn't make sense for him to not go around. I swear the saying that you go cold when you're terrified is absolutely true. It could have been a summer's day at 95 degrees and my bones would have been cold. My heart just sank and my breathing was uncontrollable. I felt like I had no control over my body as I realized this guy was following me. My blood truly ran cold and my hands shook as tears formed and my skin felt tight. My body felt like it wasn't ready to fight or flight, but simply freeze there and die. It only got worse as the second time I turned my head to see the car stop. I stopped. My whole world stopped. I couldn't stop staring. Just froze and breathing like all my school books were on my chest. Crying silently, my eyes hurt with no tears or sound as I just stood there. The door opened after what felt like hours, but only seconds, maybe a minute. And it was in fact him. It was the attractive guy from the photos, not a catfish, but something seemed different. At first I thought it was his angry expression, but soon realized he was definitely not 19. He was more like 30 plus. I could barely think over the loud sound of my heart racing as it froze me in place. I thought I was about to throw up as he spoke to me. He told me to get in the car, or he'd light my house on fire and kill my dog in front of me. I honestly just couldn't move, couldn't reach for my phone as his words just froze me. And like some magic, we both failed to notice the little old lady on her porch watching this play out. Suddenly, I hear her yell, "Get away from that girl right now before I burn you alive." We both turned to meet her eyes. Pissed off small lady about 60 or 70 years old with white hair. I think she noticed my frozen and fierce state as she told me to get over to her quickly. Like that, I ran over to her, tossing my heavy brick of a backpack. It was obvious he was unsure of what to do next as he stood there and watched me run to her. It must have been the sight of this thin, tiny old lady standing in front of a teenage girl yelling at this man to go away. He got into his car and drove off as I simply collapsed. All that fear just came out as I cried harder and harder as my brain sifted through the past few months of mistakes. After calming me down enough to speak in non-hyperventilating words, she asked me if I knew him. I told her kind of, but only from an online video game, not real life. Of course, explaining it wasn't easy. She got on the phone with the school counselor, her daughter apparently, and told her my name. I was well known to her daughter, ironically, but it was only 250 or less kids in the school and the town itself was small. Many staff at our school had family in town, kids at school they were related to either by their own children or their siblings' children. It was the kind of town if you didn't leave by a certain age, you were stuck there. So honestly, it seems ironic, but entirely not a huge surprise. The counselor was well aware of my family and my mom's drug addiction as child services had been involved a few times. She came by in 10 minutes to pick me up and asked me a ton of questions, of course knowing I didn't want to involve police, as I was scared of being taken away from my parents again. FYI, foster care was worse than a drugged out mom on prescriptions. We weren't rich, but we were more well off than many. Though my mom worked, my dad kept my mom on a tight budget to keep her from buying prescriptions from Canada she wasn't prescribed, hence her trying to take my money. She knew all of this and knew though rough I was better off than foster care, which was a gamble with losing odds at best. Plus 2 more years and I'd be off to college anyway, so we didn't involve the cops, but she made me promise to take the bus every day and to inform my dad of the situation. She also called my dad at work to inform him and had a teacher make sure I got on the bus every day till I graduated even. It really sucked, but I understood it. If it ended there, it would be nice, but there's still a bit more, and I'm sorry for the length and grammar. It's late at night, and I'm recalling the memory and typing from my phone. 2 days after this, my dad had to fly out for business. My brother was off at college, so it left me and my high mom, who promised my dad she'd stay sober while he was gone, but I was used to helping her while she was high. It was like taking care of a child. But I was on edge as ever creak in that big house from the 60s. Cat stir at night and dog barking outside set me on edge. I barely even slept. My friends from World of Warcraft called me every night making sure I was okay for the past month. I lived in the middle of the woods next to a huge river in my backyard, so there was still a lot of wildlife outside in the dead silence of the cold months. Running water is an important source of water when the lakes freeze. I'd been used to all the bumps at night, cats coming and going, and the dog barking at every animal in the yard. But it all seemed new to me as I laid in bed trying to drown out my fears. The house I grew up in was a 6-bedroom house. I had a little sister too, but she stayed with my grandma in another state per court order, while I was allowed to choose due to her only being 9 and me being 16. The other rooms were used as a game room, an office for my dad, and a guest room mostly for when my sister visited with my grandma, so she'd have a room. So in a large house like that in the middle of the woods, it was scary to virtually be alone because my mom accounted for defenseless. I was letting my last cat inside for the night. I had 5 cats who all knew to come in at night for dinner and stayed until morning. And at the end of the long driveway between my neighbor and our house was parked a black car. I quickly shut the door and locked it after my cat got inside. I made sure all 5 doors were locked and even put cardboard on the glass doors of the pool. I don't know, hoping if he broke them it would delay him if that car was his. I went and turned off all the lights and got all my cats into one room so I knew they were safe. Here's the thing about my dog. He's untrained for the most part, but was basically a giant lab puppy in his mind. But he growled at strangers, not barked like at animals. We had to keep him outside if we had guests, but he never bit anyone, and if you spent enough time around him, he'd eventually accept you. Also, he didn't growl at all strangers either, so he wasn't the most reliable guard dog. But he was big and had a deep bark. I mulled over what to do as I sat there in the dark with my dog, waiting for a shadow to pass by the window. I eventually went upstairs to my mom's room and woke her up from her sleeping pill slumber. Groggy and still kinda high, she didn't quite grasp what I was telling her till I started crying. She sort of sobered up and asked me to get her some coffee, and I did. All while I'm watching my dog's every move because I know he could sense something before I did. As my mom sobered, her fear in her eyes grew. Eventually, she got the idea to call my neighbors and ask them if they knew the car. They both said no. 2 of the men went out of their house to check the car together. The car was empty. At closer inspection, though, they noticed it was a newer car, a Lexus, and in the passenger seat was a laptop. The car was locked, but with a flashlight you could see somewhat into the tinted windows. They never told us why, but something they saw in the car prompted them to call the local sheriff. There's only one, and he lived in the town, sort of thing. We were too small to have a police department. He drove over about 15 minutes later, ran the plates, and asked the houses around about it. Apparently it was a rental car from Ohio, and he was calling to see who it was rented out to, but the offices were closed, I think. He stuck around in his car for about an hour till someone came out of the woods and ran back in, as the cop turned his spotlight on him. I couldn't see what he was pointing at with his light, as it was at the side of my house and I wasn't looking at the front. I guess he called for backup, as 3 other cop cars showed up in 5 minutes of it from the neighboring town on highway patrol, I don't know. At that point, a lady cop got out as I asked to speak with her, and she called my counselor at school to explain who that might be. I was pretty shy back then, but I don't know, something about a female cop made me feel more comfortable to open up to. I told her the gist of the story, then she called my counselor who backed up my story, but also explained why I was scared of cops because of my history with foster care and not wanting to go back. At which a mostly sober mom joined me, hugging me, doing her typical apologetic routine, but also offering much needed comfort as she called my dad too. Eventually, the lady cop asked if she could take a look around the house to see if things were secure and get any information from my laptop about him. In her search, she found something I didn't think about checking. The basement door was not just unlocked, but open. It's never unlocked, so I didn't even think to check it as our backyard floods in the spring due to the beaver dams, and it's got extra seals and stuff to prevent the basement from flooding. But the stuff sealing it, which was mostly sandbags and stuff, were set aside. But the door at the bottom of the stairs was locked still though. It had some damage like someone tried picking it. But he had access to half the basement. That was storage. Basement was sectioned off and the other half used to be used for my brother's parties. The door between the sections was like a front door, not an indoor door. As in the summertime, my dad left the hatch open to dry out the basement and adjust pool settings, as it was basically the pool house and the cats loved it, so it also had a few cat beds. The section that led upstairs was locked from the inside, and the wall and door were not drywall and cheap door, but lock and key heavy door, and the wall was made of bricks. Upon noticing this, my dad confirmed that he had not left it open. My suspicions were that the black car was his. My suspicions of the black car being his were pretty much confirmed. As we walked through the house to make sure everything was still safe, she got on my laptop as they searched the woods. I gave her everything I had, his photos, username, and she even checked to see if his credit card was still on my account, but it wasn't. But the last few digits were. She then asked to take my laptop for a few days as she thought she could get some good evidence from it. I asked her to please not damage it and return it as soon as possible because I used it a lot. Before smartphones, it was all I had. After a few hours and onlooking neighbors had gone to bed, the cops came back empty-handed but left a cop outside our house, and they towed this guy's car. From what the lady cop told me, what permitted such fear was that in the car there were 2 guns, some sort of rope, and handcuffs. And the guy who ran back into the dense woods was wearing a winter ski mask. Not out of season, but suspicious nonetheless. So eventually I try and lay down and go to sleep, but I was pretty sure I was going to call out sick tomorrow and kept all my cats inside for the day. I was too restless to sleep. Every sound made me so scared. My mom slept with the dog in her room. I'm very allergic to animals, but less to cats, as I kind of built up a tolerance to cats but not dogs. So my cat slept in my room most nights by choice, as my room was usually the warmest. At 3:30 in the morning, I heard a knock at the back door, and a guy say, "Undercover police officer, open up." I was still awake as I walked downstairs to make out a guy standing in the dark with a gun. As he saw me, he demanded I let him in now, as he needed to speak with me. Something felt off. My gut knew it before I did that this guy's voice seemed forced, like someone purposely making their voice deeper. And why was he at the back door? So I turned on the light outside, and sure enough, it was him. I just screamed as quickly as I screamed. He started hitting the door hard. It wasn't a very loud horror movie scream, but more like a gasp scream. I don't think the fear in my body had a loud scream to let out, but the banging was pretty loud as I ran to the front to see if the officer was still outside. He was, but he wasn't getting out of his car. I didn't want to run outside as I'm not a fast runner, so I turned the porch lights on and off a couple times, but still nothing. After a minute, my dog came bolting down to the door, barking and growling and nearly foaming at the mouth. Soon followed my mom, who yelled she had a gun. She didn't, but a bluff is a bluff. Somehow, during all this, the cop outside had snuck around back and had his gun pointed at him, yelling to put his gun down. I hid as the rest went down, but he was arrested. No trial needed me to attend, and my statement was enough. Come to find out, he wasn't even American. The car was rented under his friend's name, and after all was done, he was deported back to Canada. I assumed something for this passport would prevent him from coming back to the United States, as the cop reassured me that he couldn't come back to the US now. I don't know exactly what he was charged with, but I think my dad said aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, and something else. It also turned out he was 32 years old, not 19, so I assume me being a minor carried a charge as well. And so life moved on from there. I had plenty of creeps before and after, but he was by far the worst from World of Warcraft. I had a couple more from streaming, but I was an adult and much better at staying safe online. Only one worse than this guy was my ex-boyfriend's cousin, who made my life hell for a couple years. But that's another story for another time. I've been through some scary experiences, but this was the worst thing I feel that I've ever gone through in my life. I used to be a very naive, innocent kind of person. I was the type of optimist who believed there was a touch of goodness in every heart. A dangerous mindset to be in. I realize now that seeing the world through my rose-colored glasses put a big, flashing red target on my back. Often, when you think of scary stories involving creepy behavior and psychological abuse, you think of an occurrence from a stranger. In my case, it came from my mother-in-law. My husband's mother initially adored me, not for any reason other than thinking that I could be easily controlled. I was meek with a passive personality, so it made sense that I would come across like someone who could be easily influenced. Looking back on it, I cringe at how creepy the situation really was. For the sake of this story, I'll call my mother-in-law by the name of Mrs. Psycho. At the beginning of my relationship with my husband, Mrs. Psycho and I were getting along great, or so I thought. She'd take me shopping, give compliments about my hair and girly stuff like that. As the relationship with my partner grew more serious, she'd rant and rave to everyone in our neighborhood about how much she adored me and how I was like the daughter she never had. So naturally, I thought things were progressing positively, but certain things were just really off about Mrs. Psycho. I noticed little tidbits of her behavior at parties and neighborhood social gatherings. She would sulk in a corner, and I'd chuck it up as her being socially awkward or anxious, but looking back at it now, I noticed that she was always whimpering about something negative going on in her life. How she fell off her bike and hurt her elbow while riding through a construction zone. How one neighbor complained about her parking in front of his house. Losing her job because she didn't get along with a coworker. The list went on and on. In every story, she portrayed herself as a victim of unusual circumstances. One huge red flag that my mind didn't understand at the time was the story she was always telling about her other son, my partner's brother. She'd say some really disturbing things about how he'd held her, my partner, and his dad hostage in their own home, and how he'd physically punched their father in the face. The way she described the story made it sound like my partner's brother was a bully to the whole family, and my partner didn't seem to think it was quite as severe as she made it sound. Regardless, in all her wild stories and accusations about him, she always scolded her son in ways that I just can't ever imagine scolding my own child. What my husband and I didn't fully interpret at the time was the underlying problem, which wasn't necessarily his brother, but the woman who had been a driving force for the insanity behind the behavior. Psychological abuse can trigger emotional responses in very predictable and disturbing ways. Mrs. Psycho's behavior became evidently creepy after our engagement. She showed signs of unhealthy enmeshment. First, she was angry that we didn't tell her immediately when we got engaged. Then she was angry when we changed the wedding date without first asking for her permission. She expressed a desire for my future husband and I to live in the upstairs of her house and pay her rent. We told her that we can afford our own home and we want to start a family, so that wouldn't work out. The infuriation in her eyes was frightening. She would look normal one moment, then, if you told her something she didn't want to hear, her eyes would turn black. The memory of her eyes still sends me with a frightening chill down my spine. From there, she became increasingly controlling. Mrs. Psycho and her husband, Mr. Psycho, would start showing up to our house every other day or so. I started counting how long they could go without having to see us, and that number came to 3 days. There was no privacy, and I felt that I had to close the curtains over our windows every night. I just had that uneasy feeling, I locked the bedroom door as routine before bed, just to be on the extra safe side. Despite our relationship being pleasant in the beginning, I noticed that I was now feeling like I was treading on eggshells around Mrs. Psycho, or rather, landmines. It seemed like anything I said was offensive to her, no matter how innocent. I realized I couldn't talk to her like I used to be able to when me and her son were just dating. I remembered when we'd be able to have nice, in-depth conversations, and I had allowed myself to be vulnerable with her. I confided in her about how I had a lot of social anxiety, and that her son came into my life during a time that I was suffering from crippling depression. I talked about how he'd brought a ray of sunshine into my life, thinking that speaking kindly about her son would please her, but she just had this unfeeling, glazed look across her face. Hoping to mend my relationship with her, I decided to help her out one day with organizing her antiques. She had this hobby of going to auctions and buying and selling knickknacks, buttons, and stuff like that. She would get very proud of her collection of things that I sort of thought were junk, but to be polite, I told her I saw beauty in these things, hoping to get back on her good side. There were some creepy dolls in the mix, including this horrifying looking vampire doll with piercing red eyes. She said she'd had that doll for years and used to scare sons with it when they were little kids. She laughed at this memory, and the sound of her laugh had this eerie and satanical vibe to it. As if this wasn't enough to freak me out, she then told me the story about how a female coworker complained about her to the HR department at her company. To seek revenge on the woman, Mrs. Psycho wrote a letter that was meant for the coworker's husband, telling him that she was cheating on him. To remain as anonymous as possible, she told me how she slipped on a pair of black gloves and drove the letter to a faraway location so that her address couldn't be traced. I remember feeling very uneasy about her story, wondering how she could get angry enough to drive hours away just to cause emotional harm to another human being. There came a point after hearing this story when I didn't want to be left alone with my partner's mom anymore. My partner tried to talk to his parents about how I was feeling like I was on eggshells around them, but they flipped the narrative to say that they were the ones feeling on eggshells around me. During this time, I painstakingly realized that psychological torture exists in the form of extreme invalidation. Not having your feelings acknowledged can really drive a person crazy. It was then when I felt a little more clued into what may have happened to Mrs. Psycho's other son. I can't be sure because I never met the guy, but I think he was driven mad by his mother's severe emotional neglect. Now, she was pulling the same tricks on me and my partner, gaslighting us into believing that we were just too sensitive. When my husband and I started figuring out that something was off, things got even creepier. His parents started showing up to our house to corner us into submission. What I mean by this is that they'd tell us stories to make them seem like victims so that we would give in to their demands of what they wanted at the time. If we denied their requests, they'd use psychological manipulation by telling us that we were uncaring or ungrateful. One demonstration of this manipulation was when I became pregnant. I explained that the smell of pizza made me feel extremely sick, but this was ignored. When Mrs. Psycho insisted that we go to a pizza restaurant for her birthday, I was confused with why I felt like I couldn't say no. My husband was in the same predicament. Somehow, I think we sensed that something bad would happen to us if we declined. This is also because Mrs. Psycho's husband and her sister had contacted us, telling us explicitly that we weren't allowed to say no to her dinner invitations anymore. They explained it like, saying no hurts her feelings. But there was something else there I can't quite explain. Something hidden beneath the surface that sounded really threatening. I had no idea why, but I just did not feel safe. Then, only 2 weeks after giving birth to our daughter, I had the creepiest interaction of my life. Mrs. Psycho caught me alone while I was on my front porch. The weather was really nice, so I was rocking with my baby in one of our outdoor chairs. She came up to the doorstep and assumed a seat in the chair next to me. Then, in a quiet and ominous voice, she said to me, "You have to share her, you know." Her black eyes flicked to the infant in my arms. I know what you might be thinking, but this wasn't said in a cute, excited new grandma kind of way. Her voice sounded cold and possessive with certain passive-aggressive intent behind the statement. I naturally clutched my arms around my daughter tighter, feeling a protective instinct take over me. Mrs. Psycho had expressed to me before that she'd always wanted to have a daughter, but was only ever able to have sons. Maybe I was influenced by the postpartum hormones or just overall feeling paranoid, but a disturbing thought occurred to me that She might want to get rid of me somehow to have my daughter to herself. I later told my husband about the bizarre interaction with his mom and how I couldn't keep up with the heavy psychological demands of his parents anymore. It was all taking a strange emotional toll on me, as well as a strain on our marriage, and I still couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Nevertheless, they were causing us a lot of stress, which was impacted on me all the more while I was trying to adapt to my new role as a mother. They even restricted me in bizarre ways, telling me I wasn't allowed to refer to our daughter as, quote-unquote, my baby. I had previously posted on Facebook about how excited and happy I was to be a new mom. I posted a side-by-side picture of me with my daughter with the caption, "She has my eyes," which was meant to be lighthearted and innocent. Mrs. Psycho commented on the post with, "My son had something to do with it too, ... which not only put a damper on the mood but also felt creepy. Like, why did she have to mention something that we all already know? It was almost as if my happiness made her all the more enraged. I really felt like I was starting to go crazy. The stress was enough to make me feel physically sick. At first, my husband hesitated when I told him about my concerns, stating the usual spiel that was natural for him to say, that they were his parents and he couldn't just drop contact with them. But something in his voice contained fear, and it wouldn't take long before he would realize how fucked up the situation actually was. The incident that drove him to the point of cutting off his parents happened when they cornered us in our own living room, demanding that we watch their unruly dog while they went on vacation for 5 days. My husband almost caved but stayed firm when he told them, "No, we can't. We have a 2-month-old baby to look after." The murderous glare his mom then flashed at me was intense and enough to make me crawl out of my skin. You know that look someone gives before they are about to attack? It looked like something like that from the movies, very primal and hateful. I thought for sure that she was about to lunge at me and wring her hands around my neck, causing me death by strangulation. I was terrified. Mr. and Mrs. Psycho eventually left our house, but they were clearly angry that they weren't able to convince us to conform to their will. My husband and I had a dark, suspicious feeling that something bad was about to happen. First, we received lengthy emails from Mrs. Psycho, mostly insulting me. She said she thought I was brainwashing her son, and she went on to portray herself as a victim. She used the knowledge of my anxiety disorder to make an argument that I was mentally unstable and quote-unquote dangerous. She threatened to post about me on Facebook and make our life a living hell if we didn't apologize for deviating from what she wanted. At the same time, she told me that I was quote-unquote dead to her and listed all the mistakes I've ever made in the past as well as criticizing my faults. I'd be lying if I said this didn't sting. My husband and I needed space to recover from the emotional wounds that she had inflicted upon us. We remained silent, not wanting to engage with her any further. My husband and I were pretty scared as well as being hurt, spending most of our days cooped up in our bedroom not knowing what to expect. But we stayed strong through the process of separating from the toxic relationship. Mrs. Psycho proceeded to make good on her threat, posting about me publicly on Facebook. She said I was quote-unquote batshit crazy, but she even went to take it a step further, saying that I had quote-unquote borderline personality disorder in all capital letters. This came out of complete nowhere. She knew I had anxiety, but I'd never mentioned anything to her about being borderline, because I wasn't diagnosed with that at all. It didn't end there though. An active smear campaign against me ensued as Mr. and Mrs. Psycho actually went door to door to everyone's house in my community, posing as quote-unquote good citizens to quote-unquote warn everyone about their extremely dangerous, manipulative 5-foot-tall daughter-in-law. My neighbors didn't react the way that was expected though. They were more wary of her than of me. Instead of ruining my reputation, which was the desired effect, most people in my neighborhood were majorly creeped out by Mrs. Psycho's efforts. They were equally creeped out by Mr. Psycho's willingness to go along with the whole thing. I guess after years of being beaten down with his wife's abuse, he was just an empty shell of a man, a flying monkey to the proverbial wicked witch. There are a few doctors and therapists in my neighborhood who couldn't officially diagnose her since she wasn't their patient, but they did say off the record that they believe Mrs. Psycho may have been projecting, meaning that she was, in essence, confessing that she is potentially dangerous and volatile, while pinning it on me. This, along with some stories of Mrs. Psycho's interactions with other people in our neighborhood, confirmed that something was disturbingly off with this lady. This information made the situation all the more unsettling when Mr. and Mrs. Psycho showed up to our house for what we suspected would be a confrontation. My husband and I were watching Survivor in the living room with our baby when the doorbell rang. He crept to the front window to peer behind the curtain to see who it was. I could see the fear on his face. "It's my parents," he said, and my blood ran cold. I immediately ran with the baby upstairs, pausing only to tell him that it was his choice whether to answer the door or not since they are his parents, but that me and the baby would be hidden away. As I made my way up the stairs, my husband hovered by the front door, conflicted. He didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, I could hear jostling at the front door like his parents were trying to force their way inside our house with a spare key. I thank God to this day that we had just changed the locks a few days before so they couldn't get in. I proceeded to run upstairs and close the bedroom door behind me, locking me and the baby inside. I held my daughter close, my heart thudding wildly against my chest. When there was a knock on the bedroom door, I reacted with a jolt. It scared me shitless. My husband's voice on the other side calmed me down though. He told me he didn't answer the door. He was trembling when I unlocked the door to let him in. His face was pale. He showed me a text message from his dad saying, "Anyone home?" Followed by another text from his mother later saying, "You're a coward, hiding behind your keyboard." I don't know what would have happened if my husband had chosen to answer the door, but I shudder to think about it. My husband and I both blocked them after that. Phone numbers, social media accounts, everything. They moved away to another state, thank God. We have since been in no contact with his parents for almost 2 years now, and our daughter is growing in a loving environment, free of toxicity. Sadly, we have had to block some of my husband's other family because they kept telling us that we should talk to my in-laws, which, by the way, feels a lot like being told, "Please contact your abuser." For this reason, I sometimes feel like it would have almost been better to be physically abused than mentally abused, because then there would be some form of visible evidence of the harm that they had inflicted. In the meantime, they have so far made no attempts to contact us with an apology or anything. Instead, they once reached out to us with a nasty, quote-unquote, "have a shitty anniversary, you two are a match made in hell," which only further secured our decision to cut contact with them. I have since armed myself with knowledge so that I will be less naive about creepy behavior in the future. I have studied up on narcissism and negative psychological impact that some people can have on others through gaslighting and invalidation. I hope everyone listening out there may be aware that not all abuse is physical. So last night, I was at a classmate's house working on a group project we have due tomorrow. I live in an apartment in the town where our university is located, and my classmate lives at his parents' house, which is in the foothills just outside of town. In order to get to the house, you have to drive along a relatively secluded and narrow 2-lane road for about 5 to 6 miles. We started working on the project at about 6 p.m., and I ended up hanging around for a while after we finished our working. So I left his house pretty late at about 11 and started down the road back towards town. I didn't realize how tough it would be to navigate the road at night. There were no street lights and the road was unkempt and riddled with potholes. On top of this, I had no cell service, so I had to drive very slowly to make sure I didn't blow out one of my tires. since I had used my spare a couple weeks back. I figured I was about 3 miles from the house when I rounded a tight corner and saw a pickup truck with a camper shell parked diagonally across the road. The manner in which it was parked completely impeded my path, and I couldn't drive around it because there was a gully on both sides of the road. The only way for me to go at this point was backward, where there was a pull-off that I could use to turn my car around. At first I couldn't see inside the cab, but when I turned on my high beams, I saw that there was a man slouched over in the driver's seat, his head resting against the steering wheel as if he had been knocked out after a bad accident. I immediately sensed something was wrong. The way his car had just coincidentally come to rest in a position that totally blocked the road was a big red flag for me. I had heard stories of people playing dead in the road as a way to lure unsuspecting people out of their cars so they could rob them. I decided, fuck this shit, and elected to go back to my classmate's house and explain what was going on. I threw the car into reverse and kept my dives darting back and forth between my rear view and the truck. I looked and saw that I was almost to the pull-off where I could turn around. When I looked back, my heart skipped about 5 beats. The man who had been slouched over in the driver's seat was now walking at my car at a hurried pace, while a few other men jumped out of the camper shell and started moving towards me as well. I panicked and accelerated backwards into the pull-off, which messed up the undercarriage of my car pretty bad. As I put it into drive, the guy was already at my passenger side door tugging on the handle, which, thank the Lord, was locked. I only caught a brief glimpse of him, but his face appeared to be scabbed and leathery. Definitely a meth head or some sort of drug abuser. I sped away and didn't slow down at all until I reached the house, constantly checking my rear view to see if they were following. Thankfully, they didn't tail me, and when I reached the house, I explained what had happened to my classmate and we called the cops. I was grateful that my buddy's parents were kind enough to let me stay the night. They didn't find anyone on the road matching the description, but I filed an incident report and they told me they would be on the lookout for similar vehicles and suspicious activity. But holy shit, I am so shook up over it. I keep getting the same adrenaline rush I got when I saw the guy charging me whenever I think about it. Please share any similar experiences you've had, as I would appreciate a good read or a good discussion to help clear my headspace. To preface this, I love to drive. Like hours-long drives to nowhere with no destination in mind. Just me, my music, and the road ahead of me. Living in Nebraska, I'd often take back roads or lonely highways cutting through the countryside to small towns and eventually cities. And I'd usually take these drives at night since there was less traffic to worry about. I've done it since I've had my license 4 or 5 years ago, and I've never once had any sort of issue, nor have I ever run into any trouble. That was until a few nights ago. For reference, I'm a relatively small 22-year-old female, and as I've stated before, I often take these drives completely and utterly alone. They're a good way to clear my head when I'm stressed, upset, or overwhelmed, or for me to get a plan together to sort personal issues out. I've also done these long and lonely drives to get away from the toxicity of my household when I used to live with my parents as a means of coping with their alcoholism. Though now that I've moved out and I'm in a much better place mentally, I don't really have the urge to get in my car and just drive anymore. However, on the night this event took place, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious with a clusterfuck of personal issues I'd rather not get into. I felt restless and irritable around my boyfriend, couldn't focus on anything else, and decided I would take a drive to clear my head. My boyfriend was understanding and told me to be careful and to not be gone for too terribly long, since it was getting pretty late. I agreed, gave him a kiss goodbye, and left. I drove around our city for about 30 minutes, but I was still feeling on edge about everything transpiring in my personal life, so I decided to drive further north down those familiar, dark, winding one-lane highways. I kept the car at a steady 65 miles per hour, taking the turns at a slower pace in case a deer jumped out around the bend, and was just admiring the vast, empty darkness of the snow-capped fields and barren trees. It was honestly a bit creepy being all alone with no cars in sight and seemingly the middle of nowhere. The few houses miles back from the road lightless and the dead cornfields withered away and covered in the snow. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I half expected to see a ghost pop up in my rearview mirror or see someone clamber out from the patches of trees dotting the horizon. The only light came from my headlights, and even then I still strained to see through the inky darkness of the night. By now it was just after 11, and I told myself that once I made the familiar roundabout that would either take you to a small town or back up towards the city, I would head back to the city and home. That roundabout was still maybe 15 to 25 minutes away, but other than my imagination picturing the worst, I wasn't really all that concerned. I mean, I was by myself. I didn't have any other motorists to worry about, right? Wrong. As I'm rounding another bend, I notice a vehicle with its hazards flashing maybe a quarter of a mile or something away from me. It was some sort of sedan, dark colored, and was angled to where only part of it was on the shoulder while the rest was jutted out onto the road. Like they had to pull over in a hurry but didn't quite manage to do that. The driver's side door was flung wide open, and as I slowed my vehicle down and angled it towards the opposite side of the road to pass, I could make out what looked like maybe blood on the inside of the open door. I didn't see anyone on the road or in the car, and I was the only motorist in sight. Cell phone reception is spotty at best in this part of the country, but more often than not, you couldn't get reception no matter how hard you prayed, which was definitely the case when I took a glance at my phone to see if I had any service. So, a lone female on the road at night, pulling up near a vacant vehicle that looks like someone had been attacked on the inside with no cell service. Now, I'm no dummy. I've watched countless episodes of investigation, discovery, and Criminal Minds, and read too many true crime books to know that this had bad and danger written all over it. But there was still a small part of me that was worried something terrible had happened to whoever was in the vehicle, and I thought I needed to help. These roads don't get a lot of traffic late at night, and the temperature was well below freezing. If someone was hurt inside or in trouble, there was no one and nothing else to help them but me. Still, I erred on the side of caution. I was still driving my car, though a bit more slowly, and as I approached the vehicle, I rolled down my passenger window a bit, shut off the music, and called out, "Hey, anyone there? Are you okay?" I didn't hear a response. I was worried they were passed out somewhere, but I wasn't about to get out and look for them. I told myself I'd call out one last time, and if I didn't hear anything, I would leave, and the moment there was reception, I'd call it in. And if I did hear someone, well, I'd figure out my next course of action then. So again, I shout, "Hey, what happened? Are you okay?" There was a silence for a beat, and then I heard rustling in the shadows of the trees, followed by a gruff voice saying, "Yeah." I was relieved at first and was about to say something in response, or possibly even stop my car and get out, when I noticed three things nearly simultaneously. As I inched my way past the front of the sedan, I noticed there was no damage to the hood or anywhere else on the vehicle, which I found to be strange considering the blood on the inside of the door. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the sedan, and they were making their way towards my car fast. The person did not have any blood on them or appeared injured in any way, and they were wearing a mask. Not like a face mask for COVID or a ski mask or anything normal, but one of those masks you would see in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I don't know what it was. I couldn't get a good look, but from its length and shape, my guess was maybe a tire iron or a crowbar or something. I don't need to tell you that I slammed on the gas the moment I noticed those things and drove like a bat straight out of hell, my heart thundering in my chest and my entire body shaking. My window was still rolled down in my haste, and the music was still shut off, so I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me, though I had no clue what they were saying. I just knew I had to get out of there immediately. I stole one last look in my rearview mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their sedan to follow chase or if they had stopped. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road watching me. And right before I looked away from the mirror, I saw a second man emerge from the trees that had been rustling earlier, also wearing one of those creepy masks and no trace of blood on him. I probably broke every law for speeding that night, but I wanted to get as far away from those men as possible. As soon as I made it to the roundabout, I turned towards town, parked in the Walmart parking lot that thankfully still had cars from who I assumed were workers closing up shop, and proceeded to have a full-on meltdown. When I could pull myself together, I called one of my friends, T, who was a police officer, to tell him what happened and what I should do. He was concerned for me, and after asking if I was okay, where I was, did they follow me, etc., he told me since it was out of city limits, he couldn't do much on his end, but he could get in contact with the local police or sheriff in that jurisdiction to take my statement and check it out. I agreed, thanked him, and while I waited for the police to show up, I called my boyfriend. Through my hysterical sobs and panic, I managed to tell him what happened not even 10 or so minutes ago. He was, as you could imagine, super freaked for my safety and wanted me to either come home immediately or drive down himself to take me home. I told him that the police were on their way to take my statement, so I couldn't leave and that I was okay, but I stayed on the phone with him until I saw the familiar police cruisers pulling into the lot. I gave the police my statement, and they assured me they would go back to the spot I told them the sedan had been to take a look, and they would try to catch the guys who did it. Though with no cameras and no description of the men, I wasn't sure they'd be able to. I didn't even get the license plate number, though at the time of my panic, the thought never came to mind until the police were asking if I got it. All they had to go off of was dark-colored sedan and 2 guys with masks. After I gave my statement, I went home and stayed curled up close to my boyfriend the whole night, listening to every sound the house made in fear it would be one of the guys arriving any minute to finish whatever it was they started. Since the incident, I haven't heard back from the police about whether or not they have any leads. I'm not sure they ever will. I'm just thankful I'm still here and that I didn't stop my car or get out. I'm not sure what would have become of me if I had. I still have so many questions that have no answers. What were they doing? Why? Was that blood on the inside of the car or just a ruse to get more attention? If it was really blood, did they hurt someone else? What would have happened to me if I had stopped my car? Needless to say, I won't be going on any more late night drives to anywhere, and I hope I never cross paths with those freaks again. When I was 13, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there they were divorced. And my mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone, and my mother was currently out of state. Now, this didn't worry me, as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that they had gone to Florida for a few days, and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was regularly leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town. And I knew most of the people, if not by name, then by face, enough to wave and small chat with, and had never before been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on USA Channel, and had most of the lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid, but because at 13, I wasn't concerned with electricity bills or saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party/people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze, because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking that the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I decided to just sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen, where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest, because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen, which leads directly into the living room, where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I had heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started as slowly and as quietly as I could making my way towards the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark in the ottoman, from playing hide-and-go-seek in the dark many, many times with friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything. It was like they were just moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing at the archway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream. However, I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and ran down the hallway. I believe the only reason I wasn't overcome was because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children do when they're afraid, and I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time, as it was right off the side of the couch. When I was 10, I got a bird for my birthday. He was a blue-fronted Amazon, and I named him Boo because it was October and close to Halloween. Boo had a large iron cage. It could have been metal, but very large, sturdy, and like 6 feet tall. And it was kept in my room, despite the fact that Boo, like me, pretty much had the run of the house whenever he wanted. This information will become relevant later in the story. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked when the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked, if they did it to mock me or to scare me. But I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking, on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. It was low, quiet, and because of that, it was even more frightening. It wasn't like manic laughter, but as if they were genuinely amused. It was the laughter that really frightened me, and I started heavily hysterically crying and looking around my room to figure out what I could do. That was when I realized Boo's cage would fit almost perfectly between the door and the wall of my closet. The cage moved quietly on my carpet floor, but as I pushed it into place, it scraped against the door and alerted whoever it was on the other side that I was trying to barricade myself in, because suddenly they threw themselves at my door, and you could hear the sound of the wood splintering and the door handle being twisted violently. Boo, who had been stirred by the movement, awake, began literally screaming and flapping his wings. I might have screamed with him, but honestly I don't remember screaming. I just remember being extremely scared. Terrified, I crawled under my bed/couch. It was a bunk bed with a futon on the bottom, metal, and waited Several minutes passed and the person eventually stopped attacking my door. Boo continued screaming even after he had stopped. Though being under my bed gave me no feelings of being secure, I didn't come out from underneath it because I simply had nowhere to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it and therefore be waiting for me on the other side. And it was also several feet off the ground, as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified, for what felt like hours. I must have fallen asleep because I awoke the next morning to daylight. The fear of what happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why, and scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there. I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside, and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out a window is a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less gracefully, as I was not, and still am not, the most coordinated human being. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house, and that's when I noticed that the back door was wide open. Scared, but feeling braver now that I was outside, and that it was morning instead of a pitch-black night, I walked up the back steps and peered inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, no terrifying man leering at me basically, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe on how stupid this could have turned out, and that I wish I could have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help. But thankfully, nobody was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterwards. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door. I had left it open in case I needed to escape, and noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, checked all the windows and front door, and then called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on forward. So terrifying, laughing, crazy person that broke into my house on New Year's Eve, please, let's never meet again. I sincerely hope no other young girl had to meet you either. I don't know if you were just some drunk visitor or a neighbor, but you terrorized me that night. I was afraid of being alone when my mom was working, and to this day, I still get scared when I'm home alone, overthink what I would do if someone came inside and where I would hide. When my cats make noise out of nowhere, I immediately investigate for fear it's someone trying to get in. P.S. My mom had to help me lift me back into my bedroom window so I could move Boo's cage out of the corner between my bedroom door and closet. We never had another incident at that house, and we moved in town to an apartment a year later. My New Year's resolution in 2012 was to get in shape again. After my first kid was born, I had lost my athletic interests, but I had every intention of getting it back. So I started running 4 days a week with my friend Hannah, who's a great runner and motivator. We would run after work, about 5 to 10 kilometers, usually favoring the forest trail. It's the kind of trail that has lighting in the darker months of the year, so you can run there really any time. Once you turn on the lights, you got 45 minutes to run the shorter trails, and longer to run the longer ones. Then the lights automatically shut off. We had been running for about 2 months when we started seeing the same man hanging around the parking lot every time we got there. This man was about 25 to 30 years of age, always dressed in sports clothes but never actually running. He never looked you in the eye either. We speculated that he could be homeless camping nearby because he was constantly there. We got used to seeing him sitting somewhere close by, silently and always on his own. We felt sorry for him. He never seemed to talk to anyone or interact at all, but there was something about him that made us hesitate to talk to him or ask if he was okay. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but something wasn't completely right with him. One evening, Hannah didn't make it to our run, and I decided to go on my own. I arrived at the parking lot, my car being the only car there. I did some stretching, turned on the lights, and set off on the 5-kilometer trail. I hadn't seen the thin, silent man when I started my run. Perhaps it was getting too cold to sit there now, that it was autumn dark and getting closer to the freezing point. He must have been there though, somewhere in the shadows, because when I got to the top of the first steep hill, I could hear heavy breathing somewhere behind me. I looked over my shoulder and I see him. He's running like a man obsessed, in regular shoes, not running shoes, with his arms moving in a really strange, stiff manner as if he was made of metal, his hands like arrows, straight and in an upward inward angle, sort of like a sprinter but more extreme, moving like a robot. For the first time, he looked me straight in the eyes, and it was the eyes of a predatory animal, and it made my heart freeze. He had never done anything to harm me or anyone else as far as I knew, but the look in his eyes alone was enough to let me know that I was facing a serious threat. I started running faster, trying to create distance between us, and I could hear his heavy breathing getting even more strained. I ran like my life depended on it, and giving me new strength. I tore off my necklace and threw it on the ground, thinking, I must leave a trace if he takes me. Something must be left behind. I tried screaming, hoping someone would be close enough to hear me, but I couldn't scream my lungs out and keep up the pace at the same time. Why is he doing this? What does he want? Who is he? I thought as I started to feel my lungs burn. Then I thought of my 15-month-old daughter and ran until I could taste blood in my mouth. He was still behind me, maybe 100 meters behind now, but I figured that if I tripped and fell, or ran out of energy, or fumbled with the car keys once I reached the parking lot, that I'm screwed. So once I reached the sharp turn on the trail, I went off trail and ran straight into the dark woods. I ran only a short distance and then I laid down flat on my stomach, my hands searching for a rock to defend myself with if he found me. I realized that I was wearing bright running clothes with reflexes and neon coloring. I had never felt so visible in the dark before. I could hear him reach the turn and thank God he kept on running. I started to slowly and as silently as possible move further into the darkness. My heart sank again as soon as I heard rapid footsteps closing in from the trail. He had realized that I must have gone off trail once he saw that there was no sign of me ahead. He stopped and I stopped. I could imagine him listening for any sound, and I held my breath and begged a God I don't believe in to make him go away. After a while, I heard him say something in a language I didn't recognize and walk off. I didn't move. I feared that he would wait for me by the car and realized that I had to get off the trail and onto the main road and stop someone. I couldn't go back to the parking lot. I started to make my way further into the woods, knowing that I would eventually end up on the last part of the long trail and close to the main road. The lights on the trail suddenly shut off. That made me calmer at first. The dark was a comfort and protection. But then, after only a few moments, it switched on again. This could mean that another person had just started their run, and soon I would have someone there to help me, or that he was out looking for me, or getting ready to prey on another lonely runner. I decided against waiting to find out, and continued my way towards the main road. It was dark and I fell multiple times, my clothes getting wet from the damp vegetation, and I started to get cold. After what felt like a lifetime, I could see the 10-kilometer trail and knew I was close to the main road. Soon I could hear traffic. Once I made it to the road, I must have looked like I'd been in a terrible accident. Blood from several small cuts from falling, my clothes dirty, and my face, I assume, petrified. My bright runner shirt soon attracted the attention of a passing car. My waving and desperate shouting made it stop. The driver, a 40-ish-year-old man, with his 2 kids in the back seat, spent the next 10 minutes or so trying to make sense of what I tried to say between the sobbing and crying. He asked if I wanted to lift back to the parking lot, and I told him no. Please take me home instead. At home, my husband insisted on going to the parking lot to retrieve the car and calling the police. And report what? I asked. No crime had been committed. I just knew that he was out to get me. My husband went back for the car. The driver's seat window was smashed and my phone was gone. So was the photo of my daughter that I had hanging from the mirror. I don't know what he was trying to do or why he chased me the way he did. But the look in his eyes, there was no doubt that he had bad intentions. Creepy forest trail man. Let's never meet again.